Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The year was 2018, and I was 26 years old when I decided to make the trek to the abandoned fire lookout tower. I'd spent weeks researching the location online, scrolling through outdated forum posts and faded photographs that other hikers had uploaded years before. The most recent account I could find dated back to 2015, which meant I was heading into territory that hadn't been documented in 3 years. The posts all mentioned the same warnings. The structure wasn't maintained by the Forest Service anymore, and entering it was technically trespassing. But they also mentioned something that kept pulling me back to those old photographs. The view from the top was supposed to be absolutely breathtaking. I'd always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something about the silence, the isolation, the way nature slowly reclaimed what humans had built and left behind. This fire lookout represented everything I loved about solo exploration: the challenge of getting there, the uncertainty of what I'd find, and the promise of complete solitude miles away from civilization. The drive took me nearly 5 hours, winding through increasingly rural roads until the pavement gave way to gravel, and then the gravel gave way to nothing but tire tracks in the dirt. I kept my eyes open for the specific landmark I'd noted from satellite images, a sharp bend in the road where an old logging path branched off. When I finally spotted it, I pulled my car as far off the narrow road as possible, tucking it into a shallow ditch between two massive pine trees. The last thing I needed was for some ranger or logging truck to find my vehicle and have it towed while I was miles deep in the forest. After checking my gear one final time, I shouldered my backpack. It was heavy, 45 pounds of supplies including my tent, sleeping bag, camping stove, food for 2 days, water filtration system, first aid kit, and my handheld GPS unit. The GPS was crucial because there was no marked trail to the lookout tower. I'd have to navigate through dense forest using the coordinates I'd pulled from those old forum posts and cross-referencing them with topographical maps. The forest swallowed me whole within the first 100 yards. The canopy overhead was so thick that even though it was early afternoon, the light filtering through had a greenish underwater quality to it. The underbrush was dense, thorny bushes, fallen logs slick with moss, and tangled roots that seemed determined to trip me with every step. I kept my eyes on the GPS, watching the little arrow that represented my position slowly crawl toward the coordinates I'd marked as my destination. The first hour wasn't too bad. I fell into a rhythm, pushing branches aside, stepping over obstacles, finding the path of least resistance through the wilderness. But as I went deeper, the terrain became increasingly difficult. The ground started to slope upward at steeper angles, forcing me to use my hands to pull myself up rocky inclines. My shirt became soaked with sweat despite the coolness of the forest air. Several times I had to stop, hands on my knees, just to catch my breath. Around the 3-hour mark, I began to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. My legs were burning, my shoulders ached from the weight of the pack, and the GPS showed I still had nearly 2 miles to go. The forest had grown even denser, and in some places I had to literally push through walls of undergrowth, feeling branches scrape against my arms and face. I thought about turning back, but I was already so far in that it seemed foolish to quit now. 4.5 hours after I'd left my car, I finally saw it through the trees. The skeletal outline of the fire lookout tower rising above the forest canopy. My exhaustion evaporated in an instant, replaced by a surge of excitement and relief. I pushed through the last stretch of forest, my pace quickening despite my tired legs. When I finally broke through the tree line into the small clearing surrounding the tower, I stopped to take it all in. The structure was smaller than I'd imagined, more humble somehow. It stood maybe 40 feet tall, supported by 4 thick wooden beams that formed an X pattern on each side. The beams looked weathered but solid, darkened by years of exposure to the elements. The wooden planks that formed the observation platform at the top were gray with age, and the small cabin structure sitting atop the platform had definitely seen better days. The paint had peeled away almost entirely, leaving bare silvered wood. Several of the windows were cracked or missing panes altogether, but it was still standing. That was what mattered. I approached the base of the tower cautiously, running my hands over the support beams. They felt dry and solid, none of the sponginess that would indicate rot. I tested them with my weight, pushing and pulling, and they didn't budge. Satisfied that the structure wasn't going to collapse, I looked up at the ladder that climbed the northeast support beam. It was metal, which was a good sign. Metal would outlast wood by decades in these conditions. Still, it was clearly old, covered in rust spots and bird droppings. I grabbed the lowest rung and pulled myself up. The ladder creaked immediately, a high-pitched metallic sound that echoed through the clearing. Each step produced the same groan of protest from the aging metal. I climbed slowly, testing each rung before putting my full weight on it, trying not to think about how far I'd fall if one of them gave way. The climb felt endless, each creak of metal making my heart jump. When I finally pulled myself up onto the platform, I had to stop for a moment. The view was absolutely stunning. From this height, I could see for miles in every direction, an endless sea of green forest stretching to the horizon, broken only by the occasional rocky outcropping or the silver glint of a distant stream. There were no roads visible, no power lines, no buildings. Nothing but wilderness as far as the eye could see. The isolation was complete and beautiful. I walked around the narrow wooden platform that circled the cabin, my boots clunking against the weathered planks. A railing ran along the edge, and I tested it carefully before leaning against it. It seemed stable enough, though I made a mental note to be careful. The platform couldn't have been more than 4 feet wide, and the drop to the ground was enough to kill someone if they fell. The door to the cabin hung slightly ajar, its hinges rusted and one of them partially pulled away from the frame. I pushed it open slowly, listening to the wood groan as it swung inward. The interior was dim, lit only by the gray afternoon light filtering through the grimy, broken windows. The space was tiny, maybe 12 by 12 feet if that. It smelled of old wood, dust, and something vaguely animal, like mice or birds had made nests in here over the years. The floorboards were covered in a layer of dirt, dead leaves and debris that had blown in through the broken windows. In one corner sat an old metal bed frame, the mattress long since rotted away to a moldy, compressed mass of fabric and stuffing. In the opposite corner stood a wooden desk, its surface warped and covered in water stains, with an old metal chair lying on its side next to it. The windows wrapped around 3 sides of the cabin, and while many of the panes were broken or missing, enough remained to still give a panoramic view of the forest. I could imagine what it must have been like for the rangers who once worked here, spending long shifts watching for any sign of smoke, alone with nothing but this view and their thoughts. I spent the next hour making the space as comfortable as possible. I swept the debris out the door with a branch I found outside, cleared a spot in the center of the floor, and rolled out my sleeping pad and bag. I set up my small camping stove on the desk, being careful not to put too much weight on it in case the wood couldn't hold. As the sun continued its descent, I heated up a freeze-dried meal, eating it slowly while watching the light change through the windows. The sunset that evening was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Sitting out on the platform with my back against the cabin wall, and my legs stretched out in front of me, I watched as the sky transformed through shades of orange, pink, and deep purple. The forest below turned into a dark silhouette against the brilliant sky, and for those moments everything felt perfect. I felt a sense of peace that only comes from being truly alone in nature, miles from any other human being. But the colors faded quickly, and then the darkness came. It wasn't the kind of darkness you experience in the city, or even in the suburbs. This was absolute, crushing darkness. The clouds had rolled in during the afternoon, creating a thick blanket that blocked out any moonlight or stars. When I held my hand up in front of my face, I couldn't see it. The world had been reduced to the rough wooden planks beneath me, and the sound of wind moving through the trees below. I should have gone inside then, but something kept me out there on the platform. Maybe it was reluctance to give up that incredible view, even though I couldn't see anything anymore. Maybe it was just the peace of sitting in that darkness, listening to the forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the creaking of tree branches rubbing against each other. I'm not sure how long I'd been sitting there when I first noticed the light. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, creating phantom images in the absolute darkness. But no, there it was again. A flickering orange glow moving between the trees, maybe a quarter mile from the tower. It wasn't like a flashlight or headlamp, which would produce a steady white or yellow beam. This light had an organic quality to it, flickering and dancing the way firelight does. My first thought was that someone was carrying a torch through the woods, though that seemed strange. Who uses a torch in 2018 when LED flashlights are cheap, bright, and reliable? I watched the light move through the forest, weaving between the trees in what seemed like an aimless pattern. It would disappear behind one tree, then emerge on the other side. Sometimes it would stop for a few seconds before continuing. The movement was hypnotic, and I found myself leaning forward, straining my eyes to see more details, but the distance and darkness made it impossible to make out anything beyond that orange glow. Then the light disappeared behind something, a thick cluster of trees or maybe a rise in the terrain, and it didn't reappear. I waited, scanning the forest below, but the darkness had swallowed it completely. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Nothing. Just darkness and the sound of wind in the trees. I stayed out on the platform for another 30 minutes, partly watching for the light to reappear, partly just enjoying the cool night air despite the strangeness of what I'd seen. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the wind was picking up, cutting through my fleece jacket and making me shiver. Finally, I decided it was time to head inside and get warm. I stood up, stretching my stiff legs, and took one last look out into the darkness. That's when I saw him. Standing at the base of the tower in the small clearing between the platform supports and the edge of the forest was a human figure. My heart lurched in my chest. He was just standing there, completely motionless, and even though I couldn't see his face clearly in the darkness, I could feel that he was looking up at me. For a long moment we just stared at each other. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. I couldn't tell if it was the same person who'd been carrying the torch. I couldn't even really tell if it was a man or woman from this height in the darkness. All I could make out was a dark silhouette, human-shaped, standing perfectly still. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain, even to my own ears. The wind swallowed my words. I cleared my throat and tried again. Louder this time. "Hello? Can I help you?" Nothing. No response. No movement. Just that figure standing there in the darkness, looking up. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. My mind raced through possibilities. Was this another hiker? Had they been planning to stay in the tower and were disappointed to find someone already here? But why wouldn't they say something? Why just stand there staring? Then, slowly, the figure raised one hand. It wasn't a wave exactly, more of a gesture of acknowledgement, or maybe apology. The hand went up, palm facing me, stayed there for a moment, then lowered, and then just as slowly and deliberately, the figure turned and walked back into the forest. No flashlight, no torch, just walking into that absolute darkness as if they could see perfectly fine. I stood frozen at the railing, my hands gripping the rough wood so tightly my knuckles ached. I strained my eyes, trying to see where they'd gone, but they'd vanished as completely as if they'd never been there at all. My heart was pounding now, but I tried to rationalize what had just happened. It had to be another hiker, right? Someone who'd planned to stay in the tower and was letting me know they'd find somewhere else to camp. The reason they didn't respond verbally was probably because they were far enough away that they didn't think I'd hear them clearly anyway. The hand gesture was their way of communicating. And as for walking into the forest without a light, well, maybe their eyes had adjusted to the darkness better than mine. Maybe they had a headlamp they just hadn't turned on yet. These explanations felt thin, even as I thought them, but I needed something to hold on to, some rational explanation for what I just witnessed. The alternative, that something was deeply wrong about this situation, was too unsettling to consider while I was alone on a tower in the middle of nowhere. Despite my racing thoughts, exhaustion eventually won out. I went inside the cabin, sealed myself in my sleeping bag for warmth, and after maybe an hour of listening to the wind rattle the windows and the tower beams creak, I finally fell asleep. I have no idea what time it was when I woke up. My phone was in my pack and I was too disoriented to think about checking it. The wind had died down, I noticed immediately. The air was still and quiet, which somehow made the darkness feel even more complete. I lay there in my sleeping bag trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. A soft metallic creak, rhythmic and steady. My sleep-fogged brain took a moment to process the sound, but when recognition finally hit, terror followed immediately. Someone was climbing the ladder. I sat up quickly, my sleeping bag rustling loudly in the silence. I held my breath, listening. There it was again. Creak, creak, creak. The sound of weight shifting on metal rungs. The protest of old hinges. Someone was definitely climbing up, but I couldn't tell how far up they were. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing slightly off the metal and wood. My mind flooded with scenarios. None of them good. Was it the person from earlier? Had they decided they wanted the tower after all? Were they coming up to talk? To threaten me? Something worse? I thought about calling out, asking who was there, but something stopped me. Some instinct told me to stay quiet. I fumbled for my backpack in the darkness, my hands shaking as I unzipped the main compartment and felt around for my flashlight. The creaking continued, steady and relentless. Creak, creak, creak. Each sound sent a spike of adrenaline through my system. I found the flashlight, then the GPS unit, and shoved both into my jacket pockets. I didn't know why I was grabbing my stuff, but every fiber of my being was screaming that I needed to be ready to run. I crawled out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I could and stood up, slinging my pack over my shoulders. My legs felt weak and shaky. The creaking was definitely getting louder now, which meant whoever was climbing was getting closer to the top. Through the broken windows, I could see nothing but darkness. No flashlight beam, no torchlight. Just darkness and that terrible creaking sound. I moved toward the door as quietly as I could, but every step made the floorboards groan. My breath was coming in short, rapid gasps, and I tried to control it, tried to stay calm, but panic was rising in my throat like bile. I reached the door and slowly pulled it open, wincing at the sound of the hinges. The creaking on the ladder suddenly became faster, more urgent, as if whoever was climbing had heard me and was hurrying now. I stepped out onto the platform and immediately pressed myself against the cabin wall. The darkness was disorienting. I couldn't see the railing a few feet away, couldn't see my own hands. But I could hear. The ladder was definitely creaking faster now, the rhythm accelerating. I edged along the wall toward where I remembered the ladder opening being, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Then the creaking stopped. Complete silence. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. Where were they? Had they stopped climbing? Had they already reached the platform? I strained my ears, trying to hear any sound, breathing, footsteps, anything, but there was nothing. I forced myself to move again, sliding along the wall until I felt the corner of the cabin. The ladder opening should be just around this corner. I took a deep breath and peered around. In the darkness, I could barely make out the darker outline of the opening in the platform floor. I crept toward it, moving as quietly as possible, though my boots seemed impossibly loud against the wooden planks. When I reached the opening, I got down on my hands and knees and looked over the edge, down toward the ground. I couldn't see anything. The ladder descended into absolute darkness. No one was climbing it. No one was visible on it at all. My mind reeled. I'd heard someone climbing. I knew I had. The sound had been clear and steady and real. I knelt there, frozen in confusion and terror, trying to understand. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Fast, running footsteps coming around the platform from the opposite direction. They were already up here. They'd somehow gotten onto the platform without me seeing or hearing them, climbed the last few rungs. I didn't think. I just moved. I swung my legs over the edge and found the top rung of the ladder with my feet, then started descending as fast as I dared. The metal was cold and slippery under my hands. Behind me, above me, I could hear those footsteps reach the ladder opening. I looked up and saw a dark shape lean over the edge, looking down at me. Terror gave me speed. I didn't know I had. I half climbed, half slid down that ladder, my hands barely gripping each rung before moving to the next. The metal shrieked in protest at my rapid descent. My backpack threw off my balance, swinging wildly and nearly pulling me off the ladder. 20 feet from the ground, my foot slipped, and for one horrible second I thought I was going to fall, but somehow I caught myself and kept going. I hit the ground hard, my knees buckling, and immediately started running. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness and showing me the wall of trees ahead. I didn't look back. I crashed into the forest, branches whipping at my face and arms, roots trying to trip me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and somewhere in the back of my mind I registered that I should pace myself, that I couldn't sprint for 4 hours through the forest, but I couldn't slow down. Not yet. Not until I'd put some distance between myself and that tower, after maybe 10 minutes of running. My body simply couldn't continue. I slowed to a fast walk, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. I stopped and turned around, shining my flashlight back the way I'd come. Nothing but trees and darkness. No pursuing figure. No sounds of anyone following. I pulled out my GPS unit with shaking hands and tried to focus on the screen. The coordinates of my car seemed impossibly far away. 4.5 hours of hiking in daylight with a heavy pack. How long would it take in darkness? Exhausted and terrified, I didn't let myself think about it. I just picked a direction toward my car and started walking. The next several hours are a blur in my memory. I remember constantly checking over my shoulder, convinced I heard footsteps behind me every time a branch cracked or leaves rustled. I remember the way my flashlight beam seemed to make the darkness beyond it even more impenetrable, creating shapes and movements in my peripheral vision that weren't really there. I remember falling twice, once over a log I didn't see, and once when my exhausted legs simply gave out, and both times lying there in the dirt, certain that something was about to grab me before I forced myself to get up and keep moving. I remember the way every sound made my heart race. The hoot of an owl became something hunting me. The rustle of some small animal in the underbrush became footsteps circling around to cut me off. The wind through the trees became breathing, following, getting closer. But most of all, I remember the feeling of being watched. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck, that absolute certainty that eyes are on you even when you can't see anyone. It never left me, not for the entire hike out. Even now, years later, I can still feel that sensation when I close my eyes and think about that night. Dawn was just beginning to break, the sky turning from black to dark gray, when I finally stumbled out of the forest and saw my car. I've never been so happy to see anything in my entire life. I practically ran the last 100 yards, fumbling for my keys, hands still shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. I drove away from that forest as fast as the rough road would allow, and I didn't stop until I reached actual pavement an hour later. Only then did I pull over, turn off the engine and sit there shaking, trying to process what had happened. To this day, I don't know who or what was at that tower. I don't know if it was one person or multiple people. I don't know why someone would be out there in such a remote location, moving around in the darkness without a proper light source. I don't know why they climbed that ladder, or how they got onto the platform without me seeing them. And I especially don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed up there instead of running. Sometimes I wonder if I overreacted. If it really was just another hiker who I misinterpreted in my fear and exhaustion. But then I remember standing at that ladder opening, looking down into darkness where there was definitely no one climbing even though I'd heard them clear as day just seconds before. I remember those running footsteps coming around the platform, the speed and purpose in them. And I know deep in my gut that something was very wrong at that fire lookout. I never went back. I never will. Whatever is out there in that remote forest, watching from that abandoned tower, I want nothing more to do with it. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and some solitude isn't peaceful, it's dangerous. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'm grateful I lived to tell about it. The fire lookout is still out there, I suppose. Still standing above the forest. Still offering that incredible view to anyone brave or foolish enough to make the trek. I hope no one else tries. I hope it stays abandoned, isolated, forgotten. Because whatever I encountered that night, whether it was a person with sinister intentions or something I can't explain, I wouldn't wish that terror on anyone. God help anyone who decides to spend a night in that tower. Gray skies and drizzle that soaks through your bones. That's why when Joe called me that Tuesday morning in 2018, practically shouting about the weather forecast, I knew we had to seize the opportunity. 3 consecutive days without rain in the Cascades during autumn? It was like finding a $100 bill in your old jacket pocket. Joe had been my closest friend since high school. The man had a gift for making people laugh until their ribs ached, though he'd never believe it himself. I kept telling him he should take his humor beyond our small circle, maybe try an open mic night, but he'd always wave me off, claiming he only felt comfortable being himself around close friends. That humility made his company even more precious during our camping trips. We'd been planning this excursion for months, waiting for the right conditions. The Cascade Range offered some of the most pristine wilderness in the Pacific Northwest, with dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock that stretched for miles. We'd chosen a spot about 3 hours east of Seattle, far enough from civilization to feel truly isolated but close enough to reach before dark. Friday afternoon came quickly. Joe pulled up to my apartment in his beat-up Subaru Outback, the back already loaded with gear. We'd done this enough times to have our system down. He brought the cooking equipment and food. I handled the shelter and navigation. Within minutes we were heading east on Interstate 90, windows down despite the cool air, classic rock blaring from his speakers. The drive took us through changing landscapes, from suburban sprawl to farmland, then gradually into the foothills where evergreens began dominating the horizon. We turned off onto progressively smaller roads until finally we were bouncing along a dirt track that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the windshield. Our chosen campsite sat in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from where we parked. We'd discovered it 2 years earlier during a day hike, marking it mentally for future overnight trips. The spot was perfect, level ground for our tents, a ring of stones from previous campers' fires, and a cluster of fallen logs arranged like natural benches. Best of all, a small creek gurgled nearby, providing both ambient sound and fresh water we could filter. Setting up camp became a practiced routine. Joe started gathering kindling while I pitched both tents, making sure to angle them away from the prevailing wind. The forest around us seemed to welcome our presence. Birds continued their evening songs, and a pair of chipmunks watched us curiously from a nearby stump. By the time darkness began creeping through the trees, we had a healthy fire crackling and hot dogs sizzling on improvised skewers. "Remember that time we tried to cook those fancy kebabs?" Joe asked, grinning as grease dripped into the flames. "And half the vegetables fell into the fire?" I laughed. We ate nothing but burnt bell peppers and raw onions that night. These were the moments that made camping with Joe special. No pretense, no need to fill every silence. Just two friends enjoying the simplicity of fire, food, and forest. Saturday arrived with morning mist hanging low between the trees. We spent the day exploring familiar trails, Joe pointing out different types of mushrooms, though neither of us trusted our identification skills enough to eat any. While I practiced my amateur photography, he had this way of turning even mundane observations into comedy gold. When we spotted a banana slug slowly crossing the trail, he launched into a 5-minute improvised nature documentary that had me gasping for breath between laughs. The weather held perfectly cool enough to hike comfortably, but warm enough to sit by the fire in just a flannel shirt. We discovered a new viewpoint that afternoon, scrambling up a rocky outcrop to find ourselves overlooking a valley we'd never seen before. Miles of unbroken forest stretched toward distant peaks still capped with early snow. That evening we broke out the good beer we'd been saving, some local IPA that cost too much but tasted like hop heaven. Joe told stories from his job at the auto shop, doing impressions of difficult customers that were so accurate I felt like I'd met these people myself. The stars emerged one by one until the sky resembled a cosmic shotgun blast of light against perfect darkness. Sunday felt different from the start, though neither of us acknowledged it. Maybe it was knowing we'd have to leave soon, or perhaps some primitive instinct detected something we couldn't consciously identify. The forest seemed quieter, the bird calls less frequent. Even Joe's jokes took on a slightly forced quality, as if he too sensed an indefinable change in the atmosphere. Sunday night passed without incident, though I remember waking several times to sounds I couldn't quite place, branches snapping in the distance, something large moving through the underbrush. Each time I listened intently, but the sounds never repeated or came closer, so I dismissed them as deer or elk passing through. Monday morning arrived gray and subdued. We broke camp methodically, both of us moving with the reluctant efficiency of people who didn't want their escape to end. I always hated this part. Stuffing sleeping bags into impossibly small sacks, scrubbing pot bottoms with sand from the creek, making sure we left no trace of our presence. Joe seemed particularly meticulous that morning, double-checking that we'd extinguished every ember, walking the perimeter of our camp to collect any overlooked trash. The forest felt heavier somehow, pressing in from all sides. Even the creek sounded different, less cheerful babbling and more urgent whisper. We loaded the last of our gear into his Subaru just before noon. I climbed into the driver's seat. We always switched on the return trip, while Joe did one final sweep of the area. The engine turned over on the third try, coughing to life with a cloud of blue smoke that dissipated quickly in the still air. "Hold up," Joe said suddenly, just as I was about to shift into reverse. "I need to use the bathroom." I looked at him with mild annoyance. We'd literally just finished a 3-day camping trip with nothing but trees for toilets. "Seriously? Right now?" He grimaced apologetically. "It's not the quick kind. might be a few minutes. Joe, we're in the middle of nowhere. Why didn't you go before we packed everything? Because I didn't need to go then, he said, already climbing out and heading to the trunk. When nature calls, dude. I watched him dig through our packs, finally extracting the toilet paper we always kept in a sealed plastic bag. He held it up triumphantly, then headed into the trees, choosing a path that led deeper into the forest rather than the areas we'd been using all weekend. Going for privacy, he called back. Don't want to leave any surprises near the campsite. I settled back in the driver's seat, pulling out my book from the door compartment. A dense military history about the invasion of Crete I'd been working through for weeks. The passage about Fallschirmjäger paratroopers getting tangled in olive trees only to be attacked by Greek civilians with farming tools was particularly gripping. I became so absorbed that I lost track of time, the forest fading away as I immersed myself in events from decades past. The first indication something was wrong came as a distant shout. Not a call or a laugh, but something sharp and frightened. I looked up from my book, listening intently. Then came the crashing branches breaking, bushes rustling violently. Something or someone moving fast through the underbrush. Joe burst from the tree line at a full sprint, his face contorted in pure terror. Start the car! Start the car! No hesitation. No questions. The raw fear in his voice triggered an immediate response. I turned the key, gunning the engine while Joe was still 10 feet away. He yanked the passenger door open and dove inside, screaming, "Go, go, go!" I slammed the transmission into reverse, spinning the wheels in the dirt before finding traction. As we lurched backward, I caught movement in the rearview mirror. A figure emerged from exactly where Joe had exited, a man wearing dark clothes and a bandana covering the lower half of his face. Even from distance I could see what he carried, a long-handled axe that caught the filtered sunlight as he ran. The man moved with terrifying purpose, closing distance faster than seemed possible. His eyes above the bandana were fixed on our vehicle with an intensity that made my stomach drop. This wasn't someone trying to talk to us, wasn't someone with questions or concerns. This was pursuit. This was predatory. I spun the wheel hard, executing a chaotic three-point turn that nearly sent us into a drainage ditch. The man kept coming, now close enough that I could see details. Work boots caked with mud, dark stains on his clothes that could have been anything, the way he held that axe with practiced familiarity. The dirt road that had seemed quaintly rustic on our arrival now became a nightmare of ruts and rocks. I pushed the Subaru harder than was safe. The speedometer climbing past 40 on a track meant for maybe 20. Joe gripped the door handle with white knuckles, looking back constantly. "He's still coming," he gasped. "How is he still coming?" In the mirror, I could see the man hadn't given up. He'd maintained his sprint for an impossible duration, only starting to fall back as we reached 50 miles per hour. Even then, he kept running, that axe still clutched in his hands, until a turn in the road finally put trees between us. Neither of us spoke for the next 10 minutes. I focused on navigating the increasingly treacherous road, while Joe stared straight ahead, his breathing gradually slowing from hyperventilation to something more normal. Only when we finally reached actual pavement did I risk pulling over. "What happened?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Joe's hands trembled as he explained. He'd pushed through thick undergrowth, seeking privacy, when he'd stumbled into a small clearing. The man had been there, standing over a blue tarp spread carefully on the forest floor. Tools were arranged beside it, not just the axe but other things Joe couldn't identify in his brief glimpse. The tarp itself was clean, waiting. He was preparing something, Joe said quietly. When he saw me, his whole body changed, like a switch flipped. He didn't say anything, didn't hesitate, just grabbed that axe and came for me. "We need to call the police. They won't find anything," Joe said, but he nodded anyway. "He'll move everything. Probably already has." We stopped at the first gas station we found, an isolated shell that felt like civilization's edge. The 911 operator listened to our story with professional detachment, taking down details about location, time, and description. They promised to send units to investigate. 2 days later, Joe received a call. The detective sounded tired, possibly skeptical. They'd found the area Joe described, but discovered nothing. No tarp, no tools, no evidence anyone had been there recently. They'd interviewed other hikers and checked with local campgrounds. Nobody matching our description had been seen. Could have been a misunderstanding, the detective suggested. Sometimes people react badly to strangers in the woods. Maybe he was just trying to scare you off his property, with an axe? Joe asked incredulously. It's not illegal to carry tools in the forest, came the response, without evidence of actual criminal intent. The call ended with hollow promises to continue investigating, to contact us with any developments. None came. Joe and I still discuss that day, usually after several beers when the edges of fear have dulled. We've constructed dozens of theories about what we interrupted, what that tarp was for, who might have ended up on it if Joe hadn't stumbled into that clearing. The most terrifying thought isn't what we saw, it's what we prevented by blind chance. Sometimes I dream about it. In these dreams, I'm always too slow with the ignition, or the car won't start, or the road is too rough to navigate quickly. The man with the axe catches up. I wake just before finding out what he intended. We still camp, though never in the Cascades anymore. We choose populated campgrounds now, places with rangers and other families nearby. Joe doesn't joke about it, which somehow makes it worse. Some experiences transcend humor, existing in that space where laughter cannot reach. The forest keeps its secrets. Whatever that man planned, whoever he was waiting for, whether he found them eventually, we'll never know. But sometimes when October rolls around, and the weather is perfect for camping, I remember the weight of that axe in his hands and the purpose in his stride, and I'm grateful for Joe's questionable timing. The dense Pennsylvania woods have always been my sanctuary, a place where the chaos of everyday life fades away, replaced by the serene whispers of nature. But on that fateful Sunday in September 2004, those same woods became the backdrop for a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. I'm Horatio McCormick, and this is the story of how a simple hike turned into a fight for survival against something beyond our comprehension. At 32, I was in the prime of my life, with a successful career as a wildlife biologist, and a passion for outdoor adventures that had been instilled in me since childhood. My father, a seasoned hunter and naturalist, had taught me everything I knew about surviving in the wilderness. Little did I know that all those skills would be put to the ultimate test. The day started like any other hiking trip I'd taken with my best friend, Zeke Harlow. We'd known each other since our days at Millbrook Elementary, bonding over our shared love for the great outdoors. Our tradition of weekend hikes had become a sacred ritual, a way to decompress from the pressures of our jobs and reconnect with the wild. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows through the misty forest, Zeke and I met at our usual spot, a small clearing just off the main road leading into Oakwood National Forest. The crisp autumn air nipped at our faces, carrying with it the earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine needles. Ready for another adventure, Horatio? Zeke grinned, adjusting the straps on his worn backpack. His enthusiasm was infectious as always. I nodded, double-checking my own gear. You know it, got everything? Water, snacks, first aid kit, and my trusty companion, he replied, patting the old Louisville Slugger baseball bat strapped to his pack. It was a running joke between us. Zeke's insistence on bringing that bat on every hike, claiming it was for protection against wild animals. I'd always thought it was overkill, but today I'd be thankful for his paranoia. As we set off down the familiar trail, the forest came alive around us. Birds chirped their morning songs, squirrels scampered across fallen logs, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at larger creatures going about their daily routines. The trail wound its way through dense stands of oak and maple, their leaves just beginning to turn gold and crimson with the changing season. We hiked for a couple of hours, our conversation flowing easily as it always did. Zeke regaled me with stories from his job as a high school history teacher, while I shared some of the latest findings from my research on local wildlife populations. The physical exertion and the fresh air worked their magic, washing away the stresses of the work week. As we reached the ridge that overlooked Millbrook Valley, we paused to catch our breath and take in the view. The morning fog had lifted, revealing a panorama of rolling hills and dense forest stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a reminder of why we loved these trips so much. The sense of insignificance in the face of nature's grandeur, the peace that comes from being removed from the trappings of civilization. We found a couple of large flat rocks to sit on, and cracked open the beers we'd brought along. The cold liquid was refreshing after our climb, And for a moment, everything felt perfect. We were miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and the companionship of an old friend. If only I had known then how quickly perfection can shatter. As we sat there, enjoying the view and the comfortable silence between us, Zeke suddenly perked up. "Hey, Horatio, I almost forgot. I found something interesting on that old topographic map of mine." I raised an eyebrow, curious. Zeke had always been fascinated by maps, constantly searching for new paths and hidden corners of the forest to explore. "Oh yeah? What'd you find?" He pulled out a worn, folded map from his pocket and spread it out on the rock between us. His finger traced a faint line that I'd never noticed before. "See this? It's not marked on any of the official trail maps, but it looks like there might be an old logging road or something. According to the map, it leads to a small lake that I've never heard of before." I leaned in, studying the map. The trail he was pointing to wasn't far from where we were, maybe a mile or two off our usual path. "Interesting. You thinking we should check it out?" Zeke's eyes lit up with excitement. "Why not? We've got plenty of daylight left and it's not too far off course. Could be fun to discover something new, right?" I hesitated for a moment. There was something about the idea that made me uneasy, a faint whisper of warning in the back of my mind. But I brushed it off, chalking it up to nothing more than the natural caution that comes with venturing into unknown territory. "All right," I said, standing up and stretching. "Let's do it. But we stick together and keep an eye on the time. I don't want to be stumbling around in the dark trying to find our way back." Zeke nodded enthusiastically, already packing up his things. "Agreed. This is going to be great, I can feel it." As we set off towards the unmarked trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step across some invisible line, leaving behind the safety of the familiar and venturing into something other. If only I had listened to that instinct, perhaps we could have avoided the horrors that awaited us in the depths of those ancient woods. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. And so, with a sense of adventure and blissful ignorance, we plunged deeper into the forest, unaware that each step was taking us closer to an encounter that would change our lives forever. The transition from the well-worn hiking trail to the overgrown path Zeke had discovered was abrupt. One moment we were on familiar ground, and the next we were pushing through thick underbrush, the forest closing in around us like a living entity. The canopy overhead grew denser, filtering out much of the sunlight and casting the forest floor in an eerie green-tinged twilight. As we ventured further along this forgotten path, I couldn't help but notice the gradual change in our surroundings. The usual chorus of birdsong and rustling wildlife that had accompanied us earlier began to fade, replaced by an unsettling silence. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "You notice how quiet it's gotten?" I asked Zeke, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. He nodded, his earlier excitement tempered by the oppressive atmosphere. "Yeah, it's weird. Maybe we're just in a part of the forest where there's less wildlife?" I wasn't convinced, but I didn't voice my concerns. Instead, I focused on the path ahead, using my walking stick to push aside the encroaching vegetation. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying a musty scent that reminded me of old basements in forgotten places. After what felt like hours but was probably closer to 45 minutes, we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its weathered wooden walls half hidden beneath a thick blanket of moss and vines. The roof had partially collapsed, creating a jagged hole that gaped like an open wound against the gray sky. Zeke and I exchanged glances, a mixture of excitement and apprehension in our eyes. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I studied the cabin, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity, that damnable human trait, pushed me forward. "Let's check it out," I said, my hand unconsciously moving to the hunting knife strapped to my belt. "But be careful. No telling how stable that structure is." We approached cautiously, our footsteps crunching on the carpet of dead leaves and fallen branches. As we neared the cabin, a smell hit us, a sickly sweet odor of decay that was so strong it made my eyes water. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, fighting the urge to gag. "Jesus," Zeke muttered, his face pale beneath his beard. "What is that smell?" I shook my head, unable to speak through the wave of nausea that washed over me. We paused at the edge of the porch, the old wood creaking ominously under our weight. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. Maybe we should go, I suggested, the feeling of wrongness growing stronger with each passing moment. But Zeke, always the more adventurous of us, was already reaching for the door. Come on, Horatio. We've come this far. Let's just take a quick look inside and then we can head back. Against my better judgment, I nodded and followed him into the cabin. The interior was a study in decay. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, half buried under piles of rotting leaves and debris that had blown in through the hole in the roof. Shafts of dim light filtered through the gaps in the walls, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the room, barely visible beneath a tangle of cobwebs and fallen beams, was a trapdoor. Zeke, I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Look at this. He came over, his eyes widening as he saw what I was pointing at. A cellar? In a place like this? We approached the trapdoor cautiously, the floorboards groaning beneath our feet. The smell of decay grew stronger, emanating from the seams around the ancient wood. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But a morbid curiosity, a need to know what lay beneath, kept me rooted to the spot. Zeke reached down and grasped the rusted iron ring set into the trapdoor. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I nodded, steeling myself for whatever we might find. With a grunt of effort, Zeke pulled. The trapdoor resisted for a moment, then gave way with a shriek of protesting wood and metal. A rush of foul air erupted from the opening, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of death and something else, something older and far more terrifying. As the cloud of fetid air dissipated, we peered into the darkness below. A narrow staircase descended into the earth, disappearing into blackness so absolute it seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. We shouldn't go down there, I said, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Zeke nodded, his face ashen. You're right. This is wrong. We need to get out of here, call the authorities or something. We turned to leave, but as we did, a sound reached our ears that froze us in our tracks. From the depths of the cellar came a low, guttural growl, a sound that no human throat could produce. What the hell was that? Zeke whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before I could respond, the growl came again, louder this time, and with it the sound of something large moving in the darkness below, coming towards the stairs. Run, I shouted, grabbing Zeke's arm and pulling him towards the door. We burst out of the cabin, our earlier caution forgotten in the face of blind panic. Behind us I heard the splintering of wood as something massive erupted from the cellar. I dared not look back, focusing instead on the path ahead, praying we could find our way back to the main trail. As we ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon, the sound of pursuit filled the air. Heavy footfalls and the snapping of branches told us that whatever had been in that cellar was now following us, and it was gaining ground quickly. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt malevolent, the trees reaching out with gnarled branches to snag our clothing, roots rising up to trip us. It was as if the entire wood had come alive, working in concert with the creature to ensnare us. We ran until our lungs burned, and our legs felt like lead, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. Just as I thought we couldn't go on any further, we burst out of the thick undergrowth and onto the ridge where we had rested earlier. Zeke stumbled, nearly falling. I grabbed his arm, pulling him along. Come on, I gasped. We're almost to the main trail. But as we reached the edge of the ridge, a massive shape burst from the tree line behind us. In the fading light, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, gleaming eyes and teeth that seemed too large and too numerous to be real. The creature let out a roar that shook the very air around us, a sound of primal hunger and rage that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. In that moment, faced with something that shouldn't exist, something straight out of humanity's darkest legends, I realized that our lives as we knew them were over. Whatever happened next, whether we survived or not, we had crossed a threshold into a world where the impossible was real, and the monsters of myth and legend walked among us. As the creature charged, Zeke and I stood our ground, knowing that our next actions would determine whether we lived to see another day, or became just another mystery in these ancient, unforgiving woods. Time seemed to slow as the creature bore down on us, its massive form a blur of matted fur and razor-sharp claws. In that moment of terror, My survival instincts kicked in, years of outdoor training flooding back in a rush of clarity. "Split up," I yelled to Zeke, my voice barely audible over the creature's bone-chilling roar. "Head for the rocks." We dove in opposite directions just as the beast reached us, its claws raking the air where we had been standing a split second before. I rolled to my feet, scrambling towards a cluster of large boulders that dotted the ridge. From the corner of my eye, I saw Zeke doing the same, his face a mask of terror and determination. The creature, momentarily confused by our sudden movement, skidded to a halt. It turned its massive head, glowing eyes flickering between Zeke and me, as if deciding which prey to pursue. In the fading light, I could finally get a clear look at our attacker, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body a nightmarish blend of bear and something decidedly not of this world. Thick, matted fur covered its muscular frame, but in places I could see patches of scaly skin that glistened wetly in the twilight. Its head was vaguely ursine, but the snout was too long, filled with rows of teeth that would put a great white shark to shame. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, intelligent, hate-filled orbs that glowed with an otherworldly green light. The beast's indecision lasted only a moment before it charged again, this time heading straight for Zeke. My friend had reached the boulders and was scrambling up the largest one, his old baseball bat clutched tightly in his trembling hands. "Hey!" I shouted, desperate to draw the creature's attention away from Zeke. I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it with all my might, striking the beast on its broad back. The creature whirled around, its roar of rage shaking the very ground beneath my feet. It charged towards me, covering the distance between us with terrifying speed. I waited until the last possible moment before diving to the side, feeling the rush of air as massive claws swept through the space where I had been standing. I rolled to my feet, drawing my hunting knife from its sheath. The blade seemed pathetically small against the monster before me, but it was all I had. "Come on, you ugly bastard," I growled, adrenaline and fear making my voice shake. The creature circled me, its movements almost graceful despite its enormous size. I kept my eyes locked on its glowing gaze, my knife held out before me in a white-knuckled grip. We danced this deadly waltz for what felt like an eternity, neither of us willing to make the first move. Suddenly, a war cry split the air. Zeke had circled around behind the beast and was charging forward, his baseball bat raised high above his head. The creature spun around, momentarily distracted by this new threat. I saw my opportunity and took it without hesitation. Gripping my hunting knife tightly, I lunged forward, aiming for the beast's exposed flank. The blade sank deep into its flesh, eliciting a roar of pain and fury that seemed to shake the very trees around us. At the same moment, Zeke's bat connected with the creature's skull with a sickening crack. The monster staggered, momentarily stunned by our coordinated attack. "Run!" I shouted to Zeke, yanking my knife free and stumbling backward. "Head for the trail." We didn't wait to see if the creature would recover. We ran as we'd never run before, our feet barely touching the ground as we sprinted toward the safety of the main hiking trail. Behind us, we could hear the monster crashing through the underbrush, its roars of rage spurring us on despite our burning muscles and gasping lungs. The fading light made the forest around us seem alive with shadows, every tree and bush a potential hiding place for more nightmarish creatures. But we pressed on, driven by pure survival instinct. Just when I thought my legs would give out, we burst through a line of trees and onto the familiar gravel of the main trail. Without breaking stride, we turned toward the parking area where we'd left our car. "Almost there," Zeke gasped between labored breaths. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature had emerged from the tree line and was gaining on us rapidly, its long strides eating up the distance between us. "Zeke," I called out, my voice ragged. "The bat, throw it." My friend didn't hesitate. With a grunt of effort, he hurled his trusty baseball bat behind us. It clattered across the gravel path, momentarily distracting the pursuing monster. Those precious few seconds were all we needed. We rounded a bend in the trail, and there, like a beacon of hope, was our old Jeep. We sprinted the final yards, our hands fumbling with shaking fingers to unlock the doors. We dove inside just as the creature came into view, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. I jammed the key into the ignition, sending up a silent prayer as I turned it. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the accelerator to the floor. Tires squealed on gravel as we fishtailed out of the parking area, the Jeep's headlights cutting through the gathering gloom. In the rearview mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the creature. It stood at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes fixed on our retreating vehicle. Then, as if melting into the shadows, it disappeared back into the depths of the woods. We drove in silence for several minutes, the only sound our ragged breathing and the rumble of the engine. Finally, when we hit the main road, and I felt it was safe to slow down, Zeke spoke. What the hell was that thing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, my hand still gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. "I don't know, Zeke. I honestly don't know." As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full weight of what we'd experienced started to sink in. We had encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that defied all rational explanation. And somehow, against all odds, we had survived. But as we drove back toward civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. We had glimpsed a world beyond our understanding, and I feared that world wouldn't let us go so easily. Little did I know then how right those fears would prove to be. The drive back to town was a blur of conflicting emotions and racing thoughts. Neither Zeke nor I spoke much, both of us lost in our own internal struggles to make sense of what we had just experienced. The rational part of my mind kept trying to come up with logical explanations for what we had seen, but each attempt fell woefully short of accounting for the nightmarish creature we had encountered. As we approached the outskirts of our small town, Millbrook, I finally broke the silence. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow and unfamiliar to my own ears. Zeke ran a shaking hand through his hair, his face pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. "We have to tell someone, right? The police, or, I don't know, wildlife services?" I barked out a laugh that held no humor. "And tell them what, exactly? That we were attacked by some kind of monster in the woods? They'll think we're crazy or on drugs." "Then what?" Zeke demanded, a note of hysteria creeping into his voice. "We just pretend it never happened. Try to go back to our normal lives?" I didn't have an answer for him. The thought of trying to return to normalcy after what we'd seen seemed impossible, but the alternative, trying to convince others of the truth, seemed equally daunting. We ended up at Dottie's Diner, a 24-hour greasy spoon on the edge of town. It was nearly empty at this late hour, just a couple of truckers nursing cups of coffee at the counter. We slid into a booth in the far corner, both of us wincing as our battered bodies protested the movement. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Flo, who had been working here as long as I could remember, took one look at us and her eyes widened. "Good Lord, boys, what happened to you two? Look like you've been through the ringer." I realized then that we must be quite a sight. Clothes torn and muddy, scratches on our faces and arms, and no doubt a wild, haunted look in our eyes. "Rough day hiking," I managed to say, forcing a weak smile. "Could we get some coffee, please? And maybe a first aid kit if you've got one?" Flo nodded, concern etched on her face. "Coming right up, honey. You boys sit tight." As she bustled off to get our coffee, Zeke leaned in close across the table. "We need to figure out what we're going to do, Horatio. That thing is still out there. What if it hurts someone else?" I nodded, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on my shoulders. "I know, but we need to be smart about this. If we go off half-cocked telling tales about monsters in the woods, we'll lose all credibility. We need evidence." "Evidence?" Zeke hissed, his eyes wide. "You want to go back there?" The very thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I steeled myself. "Not tonight, but soon. We need to document what we saw, find some proof that others will believe." Our conversation was interrupted by Flo's return with our coffee and a battered first aid kit. We thanked her and spent the next few minutes in silence, tending to our various cuts and scrapes. As I dabbed antiseptic on a particularly nasty gash on my forearm, a thought occurred to me. "The cabin," I said suddenly. "We need to find out more about that cabin. How long it's been there, who it belonged to. Maybe there's some history that could explain what we saw." Zeke nodded slowly, warming to the idea. "I could do some digging at the local historical society. Old property records, local legends, that sort of thing." "Good," I said, feeling a small sense of relief at having a plan, however tentative. "I'll see what I can find out about any unusual animal sightings or missing persons reports in that area." There's got to be some pattern, some clue we're missing. We finished our coffee and paid the bill. Both of us exhausted but too wired to even think about sleep. As we stood to leave, Zeke grabbed my arm, his face serious. "Horatio," he said quietly, "whatever happens, whatever we find out, we're in this together, right?" I clasped his shoulder, nodding firmly. Together, no matter what. As we stepped out into the cool night air, the events of the day felt almost like a distant nightmare. But the aches in my body and the lingering fear in my gut were stark reminders of the reality we now faced. We had survived our encounter in the woods, but I had a sinking feeling that our ordeal was just beginning. Whatever that creature was, whatever dark secret lay hidden in those ancient forests, I knew we couldn't simply walk away and forget. For better or worse, our lives had been irrevocably changed. And as I drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were now part of something much larger and far more terrifying than we could possibly imagine. Little did I know how right those fears would prove to be, or how deep the rabbit hole of horror and mystery would go. Our journey into the heart of an ancient evil had only just begun, and the true tests of our courage and sanity still lay ahead. The next few days passed in a haze of sleepless nights and paranoid days. Zeke and I tried to go about our normal routines, but the weight of our secret hung heavy on both of us. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every unexpected sound made us jump. The world that had once seemed so familiar now felt alien and dangerous. True to his word, Zeke had started digging into the history of the area where we'd encountered the creature. He spent hours at the local historical society, poring over old maps, property records, and newspaper archives. I meanwhile focused on more recent history, combing through police reports and local news stories for any hints of similar encounters or unexplained phenomena. It was on the fourth day after our ordeal that Zeke called me, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "Horatio, you need to come over. Now. I've found something." I didn't hesitate, dropping everything to rush over to Zeke's small apartment on the edge of town. When I arrived, I found him surrounded by stacks of photocopied documents and old books, his eyes wild with the fervor of discovery. "Look at this," he said without preamble, thrusting a yellowed newspaper clipping into my hands. The article, dated 1879, detailed the disappearance of an entire logging camp in the very area where we'd encountered the creature. 17 men, Zeke said, his voice hushed. Vanished without a trace. The article mentions that searchers found the camp abandoned, meals half-eaten, as if the men had just up and left in the middle of their day. But get this, they also found strange markings carved into the trees around the camp, and tracks of an unknown animal, larger than any bear in the vicinity. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the article. The similarities to our own experience were undeniable. This is incredible, Zeke. But it was over 100 years ago. How does it connect to what we saw? Zeke's eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and fear. That's just it, Horatio. It's not an isolated incident. He began laying out more articles, more reports, creating a timeline that stretched from that first incident in 1879 all the way to the present day. Every few decades there were reports of strange sightings, unexplained disappearances, and bizarre animal attacks in or around the same area of forest. The details varied, but certain elements remained consistent: unnaturally large tracks, strange markings or symbols, and a pervasive sense of dread reported by witnesses. It's like it's cyclical, Zeke said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Every 20 to 30 years, there's a spike in activity. And Horatio, we're due for another one. The implications of what Zeke was suggesting were staggering. Whatever we had encountered in those woods, it wasn't a one-off event. It was part of a pattern, a dark cycle that had been repeating for well over a century. "There's more," Zeke said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He pulled out an old leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age. "I found this in the Historical Society's archives. It's a journal, written by a man named Jeremiah Blackwood He was a trapper who lived in those woods, and Horatio, the things he wrote about." Zeke opened the journal with trembling hands, turning to a page marked with a faded ribbon. I leaned in to read, my heart pounding in my chest. The old ones speak of a darkness that sleeps beneath the ancient trees. The spidery handwriting read, "A hunger that wakes with the turning of ages, to feast upon the unwary. They say it was here before us, and will remain long after we are dust. I thought them nothing but tales to frighten children, but now I have seen it with my own eyes. God help me, I have seen it, and I fear I am damned. The entry went on to describe a creature that matched, with chilling accuracy, what we had encountered in the woods. But more than that, it spoke of ancient rituals, of sacrifices made to appease the hunger in the earth, and of a cult that had worshipped this entity for untold generations. As I read Jeremiah Blackwood's fevered account, I felt the last vestiges of my rational, ordered world crumbling away. This was no mere animal we had encountered, no explainable phenomena. We had stumbled upon something ancient and evil, something that defied our understanding of the natural world. What do we do with this information? I asked Zeke, my mind reeling from the implications of what we'd discovered. Zeke's face was grim, his earlier excitement replaced by a steely determination. We have to go back, he said. Back to that cabin, back to where it all started. We need to find out more, to understand what we're dealing with. Every instinct in my body screamed against the idea of returning to those woods, of facing that nightmare again. But deep down, I knew Zeke was right. We couldn't simply ignore what we'd learned, couldn't pretend that the danger wasn't real. All right, I said, my voice sounding far steadier than I felt. We'll go back, but this time we go prepared. We need to do more research, gather supplies. If we're going to face this thing again, we need every advantage we can get. Zeke nodded, relief evident in his eyes. I think he had been afraid I would refuse, that I would choose to turn my back on this dark mystery. But he should have known better. We were in this together, for better or worse. As we began to plan our return to the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were setting in motion events that would change our lives forever. We were about to step willingly back into the belly of the beast, armed with knowledge that both empowered and terrified us. Whatever awaited us in those ancient forests, whatever dark secrets lay hidden in the shadows of history, we would face it together. But as the sun began to set outside Zeke's window, casting long shadows across the room, I wondered if we were prepared for the horrors that awaited us, or if we were simply walking blindly into a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. The preparations for our return to the woods took on an almost ritualistic quality. Every piece of equipment was carefully chosen and checked, then checked again. We pored over maps, plotting multiple escape routes and identifying potential safe havens. Zeke even went so far as to borrow a night vision monocular from a friend who was ex-military, reasoning that if we had to face the creature again, we'd need every advantage we could get. As for weapons, we knew that anything too obvious would raise suspicions if we were stopped by park rangers or other hikers. I sharpened my hunting knife to a razor's edge and packed a larger, more robust blade as a backup. Zeke, ever practical, had replaced his baseball bat with a heavy-duty maglite that could double as a club if needed. The night before our planned expedition, I found myself unable to sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of cold coffee, and staring at the stack of printouts and photocopies we'd amassed in our research. One page in particular kept drawing my attention, a rough sketch from Jeremiah Blackwood's journal, depicting a series of symbols he claimed to have found carved into trees near the site of his encounter. The symbols were crude but distinctive, a mix of angular lines and curves that seemed to writhe on the page, creating an unsettling optical illusion. I had seen similar markings in some of the more recent reports we'd uncovered, always associated with sightings or disappearances. A theory had been forming in my mind, one that I was hesitant to voice even to Zeke. What if these symbols weren't just random carvings? What if they were some kind of ward, a beacon or a summoning sign for the creature? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but it would explain the cyclical nature of the encounters. Dawn found me still at the table, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. When Zeke arrived, his face grim with determination, I shared my theory about the symbols. It makes a sick kind of sense, he agreed, studying the sketch. If there really was a cult worshipping this thing, they'd need a way to call it, to direct its attention. We loaded up Zeke's old Jeep in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The drive to the trailhead seemed to take both an eternity and no time at all. Before I knew it, we were parking in the now familiar lot, the dense forest looming before us like a wall of green shadows. Ready? Zeke asked, his voice tight with tension. I nodded, shouldering my pack. As I'll ever be, we set off down the trail, our pace deliberately slow and cautious, every snapping twig, Every rustle of leaves set our nerves on edge. I found myself constantly scanning the trees around us, looking for any sign of the symbols from Blackwood's journal. It was mid-afternoon by the time we reached the point where we had veered off the main trail on our previous fateful hike. The unmarked path was barely visible, overgrown with new vegetation in the weeks since our last visit. Should we wait until dark? Zeke whispered, eyeing the gloomy tunnel of trees before us. I shook my head. No, I want to have a look around the cabin in daylight if we can. We'll use the night vision after sunset if we need to. Steeling ourselves, we plunged into the undergrowth. The forest seemed different this time, more alive somehow. The silence that had unnerved us on our previous visit was gone, replaced by a cacophony of bird calls and insect chirps. It should have been reassuring, but instead it felt like a mask, nature conspiring to hide something sinister lurking just out of sight. As we neared the clearing where the cabin stood, I held up a hand, signaling Zeke to stop. There, carved into the trunk of a massive oak, were a series of symbols matching those from Blackwood's journal. Zeke, I breathed, pointing at the markings. He nodded, his face pale. I see them. They're everywhere. Now that we had spotted one set of symbols, others seemed to leap out at us. They adorned trees in a rough circle around the clearing, some old and weathered, others fresher, as if recently recarved. We approached the cabin with extreme caution, our weapons at the ready. The structure looked even more decrepit in the harsh light of day, its walls sagging and roof partially caved in. The door hung open on one rusted hinge, creaking softly in the breeze. I don't like this, Zeke muttered. It feels like we're being watched. I knew exactly what he meant. There was a palpable sense of malevolence in the air, as if the very forest around us was hostile to our presence. We entered the cabin, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The interior was much as we remembered it. Broken furniture, piles of moldering leaves, and that trapdoor in the corner. Zeke and I exchanged a look. We both knew what we had to do, but the memory of what had emerged from that cellar last time made us hesitate. Together? I asked, gripping the handle of my knife tightly. Zeke nodded, raising his mag light like a club. Together. I grasped the iron ring of the trapdoor and pulled. It opened more easily this time, as if inviting us down into the darkness below. The same foul odor wafted up from the opening, but there was no sound, no movement from the depths. Switching on our flashlights, we descended the narrow stairs. The cellar was a single room, earthen-floored and surprisingly large. Our lights revealed scattered bones, some human, some animal, and crude stone altars stained dark with what could only be blood. My God, Zeke whispered, his voice shaking. What happened here? I was about to respond when my light fell upon something that made my blood run cold. There, scratched into the earthen wall of the cellar, was a vast mural of symbols and pictographs. It depicted scenes of sacrifice, of rituals performed beneath a moonless sky, and at the center of it all, a creature that matched the monster we had encountered. But it was more than just a picture. As I stared at the mural, I felt a sense of vertigo, as if I was looking through a window into another world. The symbols seemed to writhe and pulse, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard chanting, distant but growing louder. Zeke, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. We need to get out of here, now. But Zeke didn't respond. He stood transfixed before the mural, his flashlight beams steady on the central figure of the creature. Don't you see? He said, his voice oddly calm. It's beautiful. It's been waiting for us. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away, but he shrugged me off with surprising strength. Zeke, snap out of it, I shouted, panic rising in my chest. He turned to me then, and in the harsh beam of my flashlight, I saw that his eyes had changed. They glowed with the same eerie green light as the creature's had. It's too late, Horatio, Zeke said, a smile spreading across his face that was not his own. The cycle has begun again. The hunger awakens. As if in response to his words, a low rumble shook the earth beneath our feet. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling of the cellar, and from somewhere in the depths of the forest came a roar that I recognized all too well. In that moment I realized the terrible truth. We hadn't come here to uncover a mystery. We had come to fulfill a role in an ancient eldritch ritual, and judging by the look in Zeke's eyes and the growing sound of massive footsteps approaching the cabin, our parts in this cosmic horror story were just beginning. The cellar shook with another tremor, stronger this time. Cracks spider-webbed across the earthen walls. and I could hear the ominous creaking of the cabin above us. We were running out of time. "Zeke, please," I pleaded, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him. "We have to go, now." For a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a brief flash of the friend I knew, but it was quickly swallowed by that unnatural green glow. "You don't understand, Horatio," Zeke said, his voice a mix of his own and something older, something alien. "This is why we were brought here. We are the key, the catalyst. Our blood will feed the hunger, and the cycle will continue." As he spoke, the symbols on the wall began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence, pulsing in time with some unheard rhythm. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I knew I had a choice to make. I could try to save Zeke, to break whatever hold this eldritch force had on him, or I could save myself, flee from this nightmare and never look back. The decision tore at my heart, but in the end, there was no real choice at all. "I'm sorry, old friend," I muttered, and then I swung my flashlight with all my might, connecting solidly with the side of Zeke's head. He crumpled to the ground, the unnatural light fading from his eyes. I didn't have time to check if he was okay. I hoisted him over my shoulder in a fireman's carry, staggering under his weight as I made for the stairs. The journey up those narrow steps was a nightmare. The whole structure was shaking now, dust and debris raining down on us. I could hear wood splintering above, the cabin slowly collapsing in on itself. We burst out of the trapdoor just as a support beam came crashing down, missing us by inches. I didn't stop, didn't look back. With Zeke's unconscious form over my shoulder, I charged for the cabin door. We made it outside just as the roof caved in completely. I stumbled into the clearing, gasping for breath, my muscles screaming from the effort of carrying Zeke. But we weren't safe yet. From the woods came that bone-chilling roar again. Closer now, much closer. I could hear trees snapping, the ground trembling with each massive footfall. I laid Zeke down gently, checking his pulse. It was there, weak but steady. He was alive, but out cold. There was no way I could carry him any further. The sound of splintering wood grew louder. I turned to see trees at the edge of the clearing swaying, then toppling as something massive pushed through them. It emerged into the fading daylight, and I felt my heart stop. It was the creature we had encountered before, but larger now, more defined. In the light of day, I could see details that had been mercifully obscured in our previous encounter. Its body was a nightmarish amalgamation of bear and something insectoid. Coarse fur covered most of its bulk, but in places I could see chitinous plates gleaming wetly. Its head was bear-like in shape, but where there should have been eyes, there was only a cluster of smaller compound eyes, glowing with that sickly green light. But it was the mouth that truly terrified me. It opened in 4 directions, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. From deep in its throat came a sound, not a roar this time, but a kind of singing, a multi-toned keening that set my teeth on edge and made my vision blur. I stood my ground between the creature and Zeke's prone form, my knife held out before me. I knew it was useless, knew that I stood no chance against this monstrosity, but I couldn't run. I couldn't abandon my friend. The creature regarded me with its alien eyes, its head tilting in a gesture that was almost curious. Then it began to advance, each step shaking the earth. I braced myself, ready to fight to my last breath. But just as the creature reached the edge of the clearing, a sound cut through the air, a high, piercing whistle. The monster froze, its head swiveling towards the source of the sound. From the woods emerged a figure, hooded and cloaked. In one hand they held an intricately carved wooden whistle. In the other, a staff adorned with symbols matching those we had seen in the cellar. The figure stepped into the clearing, and I felt the air change, become charged with a different kind of energy. The creature backed away, almost seeming to bow its monstrous head. The hooded figure turned to me, and I caught a glimpse of an aged face beneath the cowl, eyes that held wisdom and sorrow in equal measure. "You should not have come back," a woman's voice said, strong despite its age. "But now that you're here, you have a choice to make. The cycle has begun. Will you run, or will you stand and face what comes next?" As she spoke, more hooded figures emerged from the woods, forming a circle around us. The creature retreated to the tree line, watching and waiting. I looked down at Zeke, still unconscious, then back at the woman. In that moment, I knew that everything in my life had led to this point, this decision. "I'll stay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll face whatever comes next." The woman nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Then let the awakening begin. May the old gods have mercy on us all." As the hooded figures began to chant, their voices rising in an otherworldly harmony, I realized that our ordeal in these woods had been just the beginning. We had stumbled into something far older and more terrifying than we could have imagined, and the consequences of our discovery were only just starting to unfold. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the clearing into twilight. As darkness fell, the chanting grew louder, and the air itself seemed to thicken with power. Whatever was coming, whatever cosmic horror we had awakened, I knew that the world would never be the same again. And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, I steeled myself for what was to come, knowing that the true test of our courage and sanity still lay ahead. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, as full darkness descended upon the clearing. The hooded figures swayed in unison, their voices blending into a single, otherworldly sound that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath our feet. Zeke stirred beside me, groaning as he regained consciousness. I knelt beside him, relief flooding through me as his eyes fluttered open. Normal eyes, free of that unnatural green glow. "Horatio," he mumbled, confusion evident in his voice. What's happening?" Before I could answer, the elderly woman who seemed to be leading this strange group stepped forward, her weathered face grave in the flickering light of torches that had sprung up around the clearing. "The time has come," she intoned, her voice carrying easily over the chanting. "The stars align, and the old one stirs in its slumber. We must complete the ritual, or all will be lost." Zeke struggled to sit up, his eyes widening as he took in the scene around us. The hooded figures, the monstrous creature lurking at the edge of the clearing, the strange symbols glowing faintly on the trees. "I remember," he whispered, his face pale. "Oh God, Horatio, I remember everything. What they showed me, what they want us to do." The old woman's eyes locked onto Zeke, a mix of sympathy and steely resolve in her gaze. "Then you know what must be done. The cycle must continue, or the consequences will be beyond imagining." I helped Zeke to his feet, my mind racing. "What cycle? What are you talking about?" The woman sighed, leaning heavily on her staff. "It is a bargain struck long ago, before your ancestors ever set foot on these shores. The old one sleeps beneath the earth, dreaming its vast and terrible dreams. But it must be fed, must be appeased, or it will awaken fully, and if that happens, the world as you know it will end." As she spoke, the chanting reached a fever pitch. The symbols carved into the trees began to glow brighter, pulsing in time with the rhythm. The creature at the edge of the woods let out a low, keening sound that set my teeth on edge. "Every generation the old one stirs," the woman continued. "And every generation too must be chosen to complete the ritual, to offer themselves as sacrifice not of flesh but of spirit, to bear witness to the horrors beyond and carry that knowledge back into the world." Understanding dawned on me, cold and terrible. "Us," I said. "You chose us for this sacrifice." The woman nodded solemnly. "You were drawn here, as all chosen ones are. Your encounter with the Guardian," she gestured towards the monstrous creature, "was the first test. Your return, driven by curiosity and courage, was the second. Now comes the final trial." Zeke gripped my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Horatio, we can't. What they're asking, it's too much. We have to run, have to get out of here." Part of me wanted to agree, to flee from this madness and never look back. But a larger part, the part that had driven me to return to these woods in search of answers, knew that running was no longer an option. "What happens if we refuse?" I asked the old woman, already suspecting the answer. Her eyes met mine, filled with a sadness older than time itself. "Then the old one will awaken fully, and your world will be consumed by horrors beyond imagining. Millions will die, and those who survive will envy the dead." The weight of the choice before us was staggering. To save the world, we would have to sacrifice our sanity, our innocence, perhaps even pieces of our very souls. I turned to Zeke, saw the fear and uncertainty in his eyes. But beneath that, I saw something else, a determination, a strength I had always admired in my friend. "Together?" I asked, echoing our words from earlier in the day, in what now felt like another lifetime. Zeke swallowed hard, then nodded. Together, we turned back to the old woman, who watched us with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "We'll do it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Whatever it takes to stop this old one from awakening." She nodded, relief evident in her weathered features. "Then let it begin. Remember, what you are about to experience is but a fraction of the old one's consciousness. Do not let it overwhelm you. Do not lose yourselves in its vastness. You must return, must carry this burden back into the world." The chanting reached a crescendo, the air itself seeming to vibrate with otherworldly energy. The old woman raised her staff, and the symbols carved into the trees flared with blinding light. Suddenly the world around us seemed to tear apart. Reality itself peeled away like old wallpaper, revealing a void beyond that defied description. Zeke and I found ourselves falling, plunging into an abyss of swirling colors and impossible geometries. What we experienced in that timeless void is beyond my ability to fully articulate. We saw the birth and death of universes, witnessed cosmic horrors that dwarfed our understanding of reality. We felt the vast alien consciousness of the old one brush against our minds, threatening to shatter our sanity with its incomprehensible thoughts. Through it all, I clung to my sense of self, to the memory of who I was and why we had chosen this path. I could feel Zeke beside me, his presence an anchor in the chaos. When we finally returned to our bodies, collapsing to the forest floor, it felt like both an eternity and mere seconds had passed. The hooded figures surrounded us, their chanting now a soft, soothing melody that helped to ease our trembling minds back into the confines of normal reality. The old woman knelt beside us, her face etched with concern. "It is done," she said softly. "The old one sleeps once more, appeased by your witness." Zeke and I looked at each other, seeing in each other's eyes the weight of what we had experienced. We were changed, fundamentally and irrevocably. The knowledge we now carried would be both a burden and a responsibility. As dawn broke over the forest, the hooded figures disappeared back into the woods, leaving us alone in the clearing. The monstrous guardian was gone as well, retreating to whatever dark corner it called home. "What do we do now?" Zeke asked, his voice hoarse. I stood on shaky legs, offering him a hand up. "We live," I said simply. "We carry this knowledge, this burden, and we use it to protect others from stumbling into things they're not prepared for." We made our way back to civilization, forever changed by our experience. In the years that followed, Zeke and I became guardians in our own right. We sought out others who had brushed against the unknown, offering guidance and support. We used our knowledge to prevent others from awakening things best left sleeping. The nightmares never fully faded, and there were times when the weight of what we had witnessed threatened to overwhelm us. But we had each other, and the knowledge that our sacrifice had kept the world safe. As I write this account years later, I do so as a warning and a testament. There are things in this world, and beyond it, that defy our understanding. Forces ancient and powerful that slumber just beneath the surface of reality. To those who might be tempted to seek out these dark truths, I offer this advice: be careful what you wish for. Knowledge comes at a price, and some mysteries are best left unsolved. But if you do find yourself standing at the threshold of the unknown, remember that courage and friendship can be your strongest allies in the face of cosmic horror. Our adventure in those Pennsylvania woods may have ended, but the echoes of what we experienced continue to ripple through our lives. We are the Watchers, the Guardians, carrying the burden of terrible knowledge so that others might sleep peacefully, unaware of the ancient terrors that lurk in the shadows of our world. And so our story ends where it began, in the quiet woods of Pennsylvania, where ancient secrets slumber, waiting for the next cycle to begin. But for now, the old one sleeps, and the world turns on, blissfully unaware of how close it came to ending. As for Zeke and me, we continue our vigil, forever changed by our encounter with the unknown, but stronger for having faced it together. In the end, it is not the horrors we witness that define us, but the courage we found in each other to face them and emerge, scarred but unbroken, on the other side. My name is Jonathan. I've worked in the Forest Service now for roughly 17 years. That's 17 years of watching the seasons change over the same stretches of wilderness. 17 years of helping lost hikers find their way back to civilization. And 17 years of witnessing things that most people would never believe. When you spend as much time in the deep woods as I have, you begin to understand that the line between what we know and what we don't is razor thin. The forest keeps its secrets. Most of the time, that's for the best. I'm recording this because I need someone else to know. I've followed your channel for years now, watching you document unexplained encounters and giving voice to those who've experienced things beyond ordinary explanation. You're kind of like a YouTube David Paulides, at least when it comes to cryptids. I really appreciate your work. I think you putting out a platform like this, allowing people to come forth with their real-life encounters, is going to help a lot of lives more so than you'll ever know. There's something therapeutic about speaking these things aloud, about knowing you're not alone in what you've seen or heard. Now let me take away from my fanboying at the moment, because I actually do have a story that I think you'll be interested in sharing. This didn't happen while I was working, but came from a very close and trusted colleague of mine who's worked in this service longer than I. He himself is a firm believer in the paranormal, ghosts and hauntings, especially after this incident. Michael, that's what I'll call him, doesn't talk about this often. When he does, his voice drops to just above a whisper, and he gets this distant look in his eyes like he's seeing it all over again. We were on fire watch together last fall, when he told me, the two of us alone in the tower with nothing but the sound of the wind through the pines and the occasional crackle of radio static. There are things in these woods that don't have names, John, he said to me that night. Things that shouldn't exist but do. The fire tower creaked in the wind as he began his story, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Michael had been part of search and rescue for over 20 years. He'd seen people in various states of disaster, hikers with hypothermia, climbers with compound fractures, lost children delirious from dehydration. But nothing had prepared him for what happened with Dave Groves. I've never told anyone outside the team about this, Michael said, his weathered face illuminated by the dim glow of our lantern. Some things you just can't explain away. The search for Dave Groves began like any other. A man in his mid-40s had gone hiking alone, always a red flag for us in search and rescue, and hadn't returned when expected. His wife called it in after he missed their nightly check-in call. Standard procedure: assemble the team, establish a command post, grid the search area based on his last known location and possible routes. Groves was an experienced hiker and a high school biology teacher, 46 years old, physically fit, with 2 PhDs and a profound love for the outdoors. He'd told his wife he was going to photograph some rare lichen formations for his class. His car was found at the Blackwater Ridge trailhead. Equipment missing but otherwise undisturbed. We expected to find him injured, maybe a broken leg or a bad fall, Michael told me. Best case scenario, he'd just lost track of time or his phone died. Those are the outcomes you hope for. The search stretched into its second day with no sign of Groves. They found one of his water bottles on the trail about 3 miles in, but nothing else. No backpack, no camera, no breadcrumb trail to follow. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him. Day 3 brought rain. The kind of cold, penetrating downpour that soaks through even the best gear and chills you to the bone. The search teams rotated in shifts, but hope was starting to fade. Survival rates dropped precipitously after 72 hours in wilderness conditions, especially with temperatures dipping into the low 20s at night. His wife was at the command post, Michael said. You could see her unraveling hour by hour, holding herself together for the sake of their kids, but just barely. She kept saying he wouldn't have wandered off trail, he was too experienced for that. But experienced hikers go missing too. Sometimes it's the experienced ones who take the biggest risks, venturing where others wouldn't dare. Sometimes confidence is more dangerous than caution. On the morning of the 4th day, they expanded the search radius. Michael was paired with a newer ranger named Tara. They were assigned to a section of dense forest that ran alongside a steep ravine, difficult terrain that had been deemed lower priority in the initial search pattern. That's when we heard it, Michael said, his voice dropping even lower. A sound I still hear in my dreams, not quite human, not quite animal. A low guttural moaning that echoed through the trees. They called out Groves' name, received no coherent response, just more of that unsettling moan. They followed the sound, pushing through thick underbrush, the thorns tearing at their clothing. When we found him, Michael said, pausing to take a breath that shuddered slightly, he wasn't the man in the photos his wife had given us. Not anymore. The man they found was naked, covered in mud, and what appeared to be blood. He was crouched over the carcass of a rabbit, tearing into it with his bare teeth. His skin was scratched and bruised, with deep lacerations across his back and arms. But it was his eyes that haunted Michael the most. They were black, he whispered. Not just the pupils, not just the irises, all of it completely black, like looking into empty space. No reflection, no light, just void. Michael stopped speaking then, and we sat in silence for several minutes. The wind picked up outside, howling around the corners of the fire tower. I didn't press him to continue. Some memories need time and space to be approached. Eventually he cleared his throat and continued. You ever seen something that your brain just refuses to process? Something so wrong that your mind wants to edit it out, replace it with something that makes sense? I nodded, though truthfully, I wasn't sure I had. That's what his eyes were like. Wrong in a way I can't fully explain. Michael rubbed his own eyes, as if trying to scrub away the memory. And when he saw us, John, when he saw us, he smiled. The following morning, Michael continued his story over lukewarm coffee, as we watched the sun rise over the forest canopy. The golden light filtering through the trees seemed to dispel some of the previous night's unease. But the hollow look in my colleague's eyes remained. We need to go back further, he said suddenly. To understand what happened with Dave Groves, you need to know about the area where he went missing. Blackwater Ridge, as the locals call it, has always had a reputation. The indigenous people of the region had names for it that roughly translated to the place where shadows walk. Early settlers avoided it when possible, attributing the disappearance of livestock and occasionally people to mountain lions or bears. But even after the predator populations were decimated by hunting, the disappearances continued. The Forest Service doesn't officially acknowledge the statistical anomaly of Blackwater Ridge. On paper, it's just another beautiful stretch of wilderness. Dense pine forest, dramatic elevation changes, and stunning vistas that attract hikers and nature photographers from across the country. But rangers talk, we compare notes, we know which areas see more search and rescue operations than others. Dave Groves knew the stories, Michael said. He'd done research on local folklore for one of his classes. His wife told us he was specifically interested in the ridge's history, said he was collecting material for a book he wanted to write someday. The search operation had begun at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday in early October 2003. The team consisted of 6 Forest Service rangers, 4 volunteer search and rescue personnel, and 2 tracking dogs. The weather was clear but cold, with frost coating the ground until mid-morning. We did everything by the book, Michael emphasized, his finger tapping against his coffee mug. Grid patterns, probability mapping based on his last known location and intended route. The dogs picked up his scent initially but lost it about 4 miles in, near Crow Creek. Crow Creek is one of several waterways that cut through Blackwater Ridge, carving deep ravines into the landscape. In the fall, when the water is low, hikers sometimes follow the creek beds as natural trails. It's dangerous. Flash floods can occur with little warning, but it's a common enough practice that the search team considered it a likely route. His phone last pinged a tower at 2:13 p.m. on Sunday. Michael continued. After that, nothing. His wife received a text from him around noon saying he'd found an interesting cave formation and was going to explore it briefly. He promised to be careful and said he'd be back at the car by sunset. The cave systems under Blackwater Ridge are largely unmapped. Spelunkers have attempted to chart them over the years, but the network is extensive and treacherous. Most of the known entrances are small, requiring you to squeeze through narrow openings that would deter all but the most determined explorers. We checked the caves we knew about, Michael said. Found nothing. No signs of recent human activity, no equipment, no disturbances in the dust or mud that would indicate someone had passed through. By the end of the first day, they had covered the most probable areas without success. The team regrouped at the command post, where Groves' wife Linda waited with their 2 teenage children. Michael described the hollow look in their eyes, the way hope battled with fear as the sun began to set. The hardest part of search and rescue isn't the physical demands, Michael said quietly. It's looking into the eyes of a family and seeing them cling to your every word, watching them try to read your expression for any hint of what you're really thinking. The second day brought in additional resources, a helicopter for aerial sweeps, more volunteers, even a team specializing in technical rescue in case Groves had fallen into a ravine or become trapped in a cave. They widened the search area, focusing on less likely but still possible scenarios, that he had become disoriented and wandered far off his intended path, that he had been injured and sought shelter in an area difficult to spot from above. The dogs were agitated, Michael recalled. Not just focused or excited like they get when they're on a strong scent. They were anxious, whining, reluctant to enter certain areas. One of the handlers, guy who'd been working with search dogs for 20 years, said he'd never seen that behavior before. By midday, they had found one of Grove's water bottles along the main trail, about 3 miles from the trailhead. It was empty, with no signs of damage, just set neatly on a rock as if he had deliberately left it behind. There were no footprints nearby. The ground was too hard, too covered with pine needles to hold impressions. It was strange, Michael said. If he was in trouble, why leave a water bottle? If he wasn't in trouble, why leave any equipment at all? The discovery energized the search briefly, but as the hours passed with no further signs, the mood grew tense. The helicopter had to return to base due to approaching bad weather, and dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The team pushed on, knowing that the coming rain would make their task exponentially more difficult. We stayed out until it was too dark to continue safely, Michael said. Some wanted to keep going with flashlights, but that's how you end up with more missing persons. The terrain out there is treacherous enough in daylight. The rain came overnight, a steady downpour that turned the forest floor into a muddy obstacle course. It washed away any tracks that might have remained, reduced visibility and dampened spirits. The temperature dropped further, raising concerns about hypothermia. If Groves was still alive, he would be facing increasingly dangerous conditions. Linda Groves remained at the command post, occasionally stepping outside to stare into the forest as if through sheer will she could part the trees and reveal her husband's location. The children had been sent to stay with relatives, spared the hourly roller coaster of hope and disappointment. She told us more about him, Michael said, how he'd always been fascinated by the unexplained, how he'd collect local legends from his students' families. She mentioned that in the weeks before his hike, he'd been different, excited about something he'd discovered in his research, but secretive too, staying up late, making calls she couldn't overhear. On the third day, they found his backpack. It was partially hidden under a fallen log, about a mile off the main trail in a direction that made little sense given his stated destination. The contents were intact: additional water, energy bars, a first aid kit, spare socks. His camera was missing, as was his journal, items his wife confirmed he would have carried. The backpack was the first thing that really disturbed me, Michael admitted. It was deliberately hidden, not dropped in haste or lost in a fall, but carefully tucked away where it wouldn't be immediately visible. They searched the area thoroughly, forming a tight grid and examining every inch of ground. Nothing. No footprints despite the softer terrain. No broken branches. No signs of struggle. Just the backpack, methodically stowed as if its owner intended to return for it. The radio crackled to life in the late afternoon. Another team had found a single hiking boot, about 2 miles from the backpack in the direction of Crow Creek. Like the backpack, it seemed deliberately placed, standing upright on a flat rock, laces neatly tied. That's when I knew something was very wrong, Michael said. People who are lost or injured don't leave breadcrumb trails like that. They don't arrange their belongings like some kind of sick scavenger hunt. The search teams converged on the area where the boot was found, combing outward in all directions. The rain had stopped, but a thick mist clung to the forest, reducing visibility and adding an ethereal quality to the landscape. Calls of Dave Groves echoed through the trees, met only by the occasional cry of a distant bird. As daylight began to fade, the decision was made to continue for another hour before returning to base. Michael and 2 other rangers pressed deeper into a section of old-growth forest that bordered the creek. The trees were massive here, centuries old, with a canopy so dense that little undergrowth survived beneath. The forest floor was a carpet of moss and fallen needles, eerily silent without the usual crunch of twigs and leaves. That's when we heard it, Michael said. A sound like nothing I've ever heard before or since. Not quite a scream, not quite a laugh. Something in between, something wrong. They froze, looking at each other to confirm they had all heard it. The sound came again, from somewhere ahead, and to their right. They called out, identifying themselves as search and rescue. No response, just another of those unsettling vocalizations, closer this time. We should have called for backup, Michael said, shaking his head. Protocol says you maintain position and wait for additional personnel when you detect a possible subject in distress. But we didn't. We followed the sound. The mist thickened as they moved toward the creek, visibility dropping to less than 20 feet. The ground began to slope downward, becoming rockier and more treacherous. They switched on their flashlights, though it wasn't fully dark yet, the beams creating more glare than illumination in the misty air. The sound led them to the edge of a small clearing beside the creek. Water gurgled over rocks, a normally soothing sound rendered ominous by the circumstances. Their flashlights swept the area, catching nothing but swirling mist in the dark shapes of trees. And then I saw them, Michael whispered. 2 black eyes, reflecting nothing, staring at us from across the clearing. Michael fell silent, staring out the window of the fire tower at the endless stretch of trees below us. I waited, knowing better than to rush him. Some stories need to find their own pace in the telling.
You ever feel watched in the forest, John? He finally asked. Not by anything you can see, just that prickling on the back of your neck, that certainty that something is there, observing you?
I nodded. Every ranger knows that feeling. It was like that, but 100 times stronger, he continued. Those eyes, they didn't just see us, they saw through us. The 3 rangers stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, their flashlight beams fixed on the figure across from them. At first, Michael could only make out those eyes and the vague outline of a human form crouched low to the ground. Then the figure moved, and the beams caught more detail: naked skin covered in mud and what looked like dried blood, matted hair, hands curled into claw-like shapes. Dave Groves, one of the rangers called out, voice steady despite the circumstances. We're with Forest Service Search and Rescue. We're here to help you. The figure's head tilted, an unnervingly animal-like gesture. Then it opened its mouth, revealing teeth stained dark with what they would later discover was animal blood. The sound that emerged wasn't words, wasn't even human. A low, rattling growl that seemed to resonate from somewhere deeper than just a throat. I've encountered people in various states of exposure and shock, Michael said. I've seen hypothermia victims strip naked despite freezing temperatures. Seen dehydration make people hallucinate and become violent. But this was different. This was... He struggled for words, then simply said, wrong. Fundamentally wrong. The team leader Rodriguez tried again. Mr. Groves, we need you to stay calm. We're going to approach slowly and help you. The figure, Groves, though so transformed they could hardly reconcile him with the smiling family man from the photographs, remained crouched, those black eyes fixed on them. As Rodriguez took a step forward, Groves' body tensed visibly. Wait, Michael cautioned, noticing something in the dirt before Groves. He's eating something. Their flashlights revealed the half-consumed carcass of a rabbit, its fur and entrails spread across the ground. Groves had been tearing at it with his bare hands and teeth when they interrupted him. Rodriguez radioed for immediate backup and medical support, keeping his voice low and calm despite the grotesque scene before them. The third ranger, Tara, began slowly removing the emergency thermal blanket from her pack. Dave, she said gently, you must be very cold. I have something warm for you. Will you let me bring it to you? For a moment it seemed to work. Groves' posture relaxed slightly, his head tilting again as if considering her words. Tara took a tentative step forward. Blanket extended. What happened next occurred so quickly that Michael would later struggle to piece together the sequence of events. Groves lunged, not away as they had feared, but directly toward them, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone in his condition. He targeted Tara, perhaps sensing she was physically the smallest of the 3. His movement wasn't right, Michael recalled, visibly unsettled by the memory. Not like a person running or even charging, more like something else was controlling his body, puppeting it. Rodriguez intercepted Groves before he could reach Tara, tackling him to the ground. There was a struggle, violent, chaotic, punctuated by those inhuman vocalizations from Groves. Michael joined the fray, trying to restrain the man's arms while Rodriguez fought to control his legs. He was unnaturally strong, Michael said, unconsciously rubbing his forearm where a series of small scars formed a crescent pattern. And he was trying to bite us, to claw at us, not fighting to escape, but fighting to hurt. It took all 3 of them to finally subdue him, Rodriguez's weight pinning his torso while Michael and Tara secured his limbs. Even restrained, he continued to struggle, spitting and snapping his teeth at them. Up close, the blackness of his eyes was even more disturbing. Not just dilated pupils, but a complete absence of iris or sclera, as if the eyes had been replaced with pools of ink. The radio was going crazy, Michael said. Everyone demanding updates, wanting to know if we really had found Groves, if he was alive. Rodriguez just kept saying medical, we need medical now, over and over. It took nearly 40 minutes for the medical team to reach their location. 40 minutes of holding down a man who never stopped fighting, whose strength didn't seem to flag despite his obvious malnourishment and exposure. They had to secure his hands with zip ties after he managed to rake his nails across Tara's face, leaving deep scratches that would later require stitches. When the medical team arrived, their initial assessment was confusion. Groves' vital signs were wildly inconsistent with his physical state and behavior. His body temperature was nearly normal despite being naked in near-freezing conditions. His pulse was slow and steady rather than racing. His breathing was controlled even as he continued to snarl and struggle. The medic who checked his eyes thought we were exaggerating at first, Michael said. Then he saw for himself. I heard him whisper, "What the fuck," under his breath. Medical professionals don't usually react like that. They sedated Groves, a stronger dose than would typically be used, and secured him to a portable stretcher. Even sedated, his body continued to twitch and jerk sporadically. The evacuation was difficult, requiring them to carry the stretcher through rough terrain in darkness now barely held at bay by their flashlights. We had to stop twice on the way back, Michael said. The sedation wasn't working properly. He'd go quiet for 10-15 minutes, then suddenly start convulsing, fighting against the restraints. The second time, he managed to snap one of the zip ties. His wrist was raw, bleeding, but he didn't seem to feel it. When they finally reached the command post, Linda Groves was waiting. Michael's voice grew tight as he described her face when she saw what had become of her husband. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just crumpled, like someone had cut whatever strings were holding her upright. He paused. She kept saying, "That's not him. That can't be him." But dental records would later confirm that it was, indeed, Dave Groves. Whatever had happened to him in those 4 days had transformed him almost beyond recognition. But physically, it was the same man who had set out on a hiking trip the previous Sunday. The ambulance arrived shortly after they reached the command post. Groves was still alternating between periods of sedated calm and violent resistance. The paramedics, after consulting with the search and rescue medic, decided to administer a stronger sedative before transport. I watched them load him into the ambulance, Michael said. Just before they closed the doors, he went completely still. Then his head turned, slowly, deliberately, until he was looking directly at me, and he smiled, a horrible knowing smile that had nothing of humanity in it. Michael fell silent again, longer this time. When he finally spoke, his voice had a different quality to it, as if he was choosing his words with extreme care. I've replayed that moment in my mind thousands of times over the years, he said, wondering if I imagined it, if the stress and exhaustion were making me see things that weren't there. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt in that moment. What did you feel? I asked, unable to help myself. Recognition, he replied simply. Not from Groves, from whatever was looking out through his eyes. It knew me, John. It knew all of us, and it was amused. The ambulance departed for the regional hospital, lights flashing but sirens silent in the pre-dawn darkness. The search and rescue operation was officially over, but there was little sense of relief or accomplishment among the team. They had found Dave Groves alive, a miracle given the conditions, but no one felt like celebrating. Rodriguez tried to keep it professional in the debriefing. Michael said, stuck to the facts, talked about exposure, possible hallucinogenic plants, extreme survival situations triggering psychosis, all the rational explanations, but rationality felt thin in the face of what they had witnessed. The team was subdued, everyone avoiding discussion of the black eyes, the impossible strength, the way Groves had survived conditions that should have killed him within the first night. Tara quit the service 3 weeks later. Michael added quietly. Never gave a reason, never talked about that night, just turned in her badge and moved away. I heard she went somewhere without forests, somewhere with wide open spaces where you can see for miles in every direction. The official report cited severe dehydration, hypothermia, and trauma-induced psychosis. It noted the unusual physical symptoms but attributed them to a combination of environmental factors and possible ingestion of toxic plants. Dave Groves was classified as a successful rescue, another statistic, another dot on the map of Blackwater Ridge. But we knew, Michael said. Everyone who was there that night knew we hadn't just found a man who'd been lost in the woods. We'd found something else. Something wearing Dave Groves like a suit that didn't quite fit. The ambulance carrying Dave Groves arrived at Regional Memorial Hospital just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. The emergency department had been notified of his condition and had prepared as best they could based on the limited information provided by the search and rescue team. I didn't go to the hospital that day, Michael told me, pouring himself another cup of coffee. I went home, showered for nearly an hour trying to wash away the feeling of his hands on me, then slept for 14 hours straight. But Rodriguez went. He felt responsible, needed to see it through. Rodriguez's account, shared with Michael later, painted a disturbing picture of Groves' first days in medical care. The hospital staff had initially treated him as they would any severe wilderness exposure case. Warming measures, IV fluids, careful monitoring of vital signs. But Groves defied standard medical expectations at every turn. His core temperature, which should have been dangerously low after nights in sub-freezing conditions without clothing, was only slightly below normal. His electrolyte levels, which should have been severely imbalanced after days without proper hydration, were nearly within normal ranges, most baffling to the medical team. His stomach contained partially digested raw meat, but showed none of the expected inflammation or signs of bacterial infection such a diet should have caused. The attending physician told Rodriguez it was like Groves' body wasn't operating under the same rules as everyone else's, Michael said. Like his physiology had been rewired somehow. More disturbing than the medical anomalies was Groves' behavior. The initial sedation wore off by mid-morning, and he cycled between two distinct states. In one, he was catatonic, unresponsive to stimuli, staring vacantly at the ceiling or wall. In the other, he became violently aggressive, straining against his restraints with such force that they had to be reinforced, growling and snapping at anyone who came near. The eyes were the tell, Michael said. When he was catatonic, his eyes were normal, brown irises, white sclera, responsive to light. But when he turned violent, they would go black. Not gradually, not like a pupil dilating. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The medical staff documented this phenomenon but could offer no explanation. Ophthalmological exams were attempted during his catatonic phases, but revealed nothing unusual about the structure of his eyes. Blood tests showed elevated levels of stress hormones, but no evidence of drugs or toxins that might explain his condition. On the second day, during a catatonic period, Groves spoke for the first time since his rescue. A nurse was checking his vital signs when he suddenly gripped her wrist. Not violently, but with unsettling intensity. "It made me let it in," he whispered, his voice raw and cracked from disuse. "It knows where they live. It knows their names." The nurse asked who he was talking about, but he lapsed back into unresponsiveness. Hours later, during another moment of lucidity, he asked for his wife. Linda was brought in, accompanied by a hospital social worker and Rodriguez, who had returned to check on Groves' condition. Rodriguez said it was the most heart-wrenching thing he'd ever witnessed. Michael told me. Linda sat beside the bed, trying to reach her husband through whatever fog had enveloped him. For a while it seemed to work. Groves recognized her, called her by name, even managed to ask about their children. Then, mid-sentence, his demeanor changed. His body stiffened, his face contorted, and his eyes transformed to that unnatural blackness. He lunged toward Linda, the restraints barely holding him back, and spoke in a voice Rodriguez described as layered, like multiple people speaking in unison. He told her things no one else could know, Michael said quietly. Secret things from their marriage, from her childhood. Then he started reciting their home address, their children's daily schedules, details about relatives who lived hundreds of miles away. Linda had to be escorted from the room, collapsed in the hallway, hysterical with fear and grief. Groves continued his violent episode for nearly an hour afterward, eventually requiring additional sedation. The hospital staff, increasingly disturbed by his case, requested a psychiatric consultation. The psychiatrist who evaluated Groves found him in one of his catatonic states. His initial assessment suggested a severe dissociative disorder, possibly triggered by the trauma of being lost in the wilderness. He recommended a regimen of antipsychotic medication and further observation, But the medications didn't work, Michael said. Not the way they should have. The violent episodes continued, becoming more frequent and more intense, and he began to speak more during them, saying things that made the staff uncomfortable enough that they started rotating assignments so no one had to spend too much time with him. On the 4th day of his hospitalization, during what had started as a routine check of his vital signs, Groves experienced another transformation. As his eyes blackened, he grabbed the nurse's arm and bit down, tearing through skin and muscle before security could respond. The nurse required surgery and eventually left the medical profession entirely. After that incident, Groves was kept under constant observation, with security personnel present at all times. Additional restraints were added, and his jaw was temporarily immobilized to prevent further biting attacks. The hospital administration considered transferring him to a psychiatric facility, but his physical condition remained too unstable. It was during this period that he began to speak more coherently during his episodes, Michael said. Not ranting or growling, but articulating what had happened to him in the forest, or at least a version of it. According to Rodriguez, who continued to visit regularly and document Groves' statements, the story emerged in fragments, often contradictory, but with certain consistent elements. Groves claimed he had been hiking as planned when he discovered a small cave entrance not marked on any map. Curious, he had squeezed through the narrow opening, finding himself in a larger chamber. He said the air in the cave felt wrong. Michael continued, recounting Rodriguez's notes. Heavy, like it was pressing against his skin, and he wasn't alone in there. Something was waiting for him, something that had been waiting a very long time. Groves described sensing rather than seeing a presence, a consciousness that communicated directly into his mind. It offered him knowledge, power, experiences beyond human understanding. All it wanted in return was to be carried out of the cave, to experience the world through him. In his more lucid moments, Groves would weep, saying he thought it was a hallucination, a dream. He said yes, thinking nothing would happen. Michael's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Then he felt it enter him, like ice water flowing into every part of his body. He tried to fight it, tried to take back his consent, but it was already inside. The entity, as Groves referred to it, had taken control, discarding his equipment, removing his clothing, forcing him to survive as an animal would. It had only allowed him partial awareness, bringing him to the surface of his own consciousness periodically to witness what his body was doing. He described the sensation as being locked in a basement while someone else lived in his house. Most disturbing were Groves' claims about the entity's knowledge. It had access to all his memories, could see through the connections in his mind to know intimate details about everyone he loved. It threatened to harm his family if he fought too hard for control, describing in graphic detail what it would make his body do to them. Rodriguez said. The doctors all thought it was elaborate delusion, Michael said. A mind creating a narrative to explain a psychotic break. But they couldn't explain the physical anomalies, the impossible strength, the eyes. On the 10th day of his hospitalization, Groves experienced his longest period of lucidity. For nearly 6 hours he remained calm, his eyes normal, speaking rationally with the doctors and with Linda, who had continued to visit despite her fear. He apologized for the things he had said and done, insisted that he was fighting to regain full control. He told Linda he loved her, Michael said. Made her promise to take the kids and go stay with her sister in Colorado. Said no matter what happened next, she shouldn't believe it was really him talking to her ever again. That night, a psychiatric resident reported a disturbing conversation with Groves. Believing him to be in a stable state, the resident had removed the restraint immobilizing his jaw to allow him to eat. Groves had smiled, the first genuine smile since his rescue, and spoken clearly. It's patient, he had said. More patient than you can imagine. It waited in that cave for centuries. It can wait inside me until you all believe I'm better. The resident had asked what he meant, and Groves's expression changed subtly. Not all of us come back from the woods, he had replied. Sometimes something else comes back wearing our skin. Before the resident could respond, Groves had another violent episode, his eyes turning black as he lunged forward. The restraints held, but the force of his movement was enough to crack the frame of the hospital bed. It took 3 security officers to subdue him, and in the struggle, he dislocated his own shoulder without showing any sign of pain. After that incident, the hospital administration accelerated plans to transfer Groves to a secure psychiatric facility. The attending physician documented his case as acute psychosis with paranoid and dissociative features, accompanied by unexplained physiological anomalies. The notes indicated a poor prognosis and recommended long-term inpatient treatment, but they never got the chance to transfer him, Michael said. The next morning, something changed. Groves woke up completely calm. His eyes were normal. He spoke clearly and rationally, apologized for his behavior, attributed it to the trauma of being lost. The transformation was so complete that the medical team was suspicious, but all tests showed normal results. Groves explained his previous statements as hallucinations brought on by extreme stress and possibly by ingesting toxic plants while struggling to survive. He asked to see a priest, saying he needed spiritual guidance to process what had happened to him, against their better judgment, but unable to justify continued restraints given his apparent recovery. The hospital staff arranged for a local Catholic priest to visit. Father Donovan arrived that afternoon, expecting to provide comfort to a traumatized man. Instead, according to his later statement, he encountered something that wore humanity like an ill-fitting costume. The priest refused to be alone with Groves, Michael said. Wouldn't specify exactly what had happened, just insisted that he needed to leave immediately. On his way out, he told the nurse on duty to keep him restrained, keep him sedated, and call someone who specializes in the old rites. But the hospital, bound by medical protocols rather than spiritual concerns, continued to observe Groves' apparently stable condition. For 3 more days, he remained calm, rational, and consistent in his interactions. The restraints were removed. Plans for psychiatric transfer were put on hold. Linda visited daily, though she honored his earlier request and stayed with their children at a hotel rather than returning home. On the 14th day of his hospitalization, Dave Groves was released under his wife's care, with outpatient psychiatric follow-up scheduled and a regimen of medication prescribed. The medical record noted dramatic improvement and resolution of psychotic features, though it recommended continued observation. Rodriguez was there when they discharged him, Michael said. He told me something that stayed with me all these years. He said as Groves was walking out, he turned back once and looked at the hospital staff. Just for a second, Rodriguez thought he saw his eyes flicker to black. Then Groves smiled and said, "Thank you for your help. I'm feeling much more like myself now." The fire tower grew cold as night settled fully over the forest. I added wood to the small stove, the crackling flames casting long shadows across the walls. Michael sat with his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, though the contents had long since gone cold. "You'd think that would be the end of the story," he said after a long silence. "Man gets lost in the woods, has a psychotic break, recovers with treatment. Case closed, file it away, move on to the next crisis." But with Dave Groves, nothing was that simple. After his discharge from the hospital, Groves returned home with Linda. On the surface, they attempted to resume normal life. He took medical leave from his teaching position, attended his psychiatric appointments, took his medications. The official narrative was one of recovery, a traumatic experience gradually being processed and overcome. Rodriguez kept in touch with them, Michael continued. Not officially. The search and rescue part was over, but he felt connected to the case, responsible somehow. He'd check in every week or so, just a quick call to see how things were going. The first 2 weeks seemed promising. Groves was quiet but functional, spending most of his time in his study, claiming to be working on a journal of his experience as part of his therapy. Linda reported that he was sleeping normally, eating regularly, showing no signs of the bizarre behavior that had characterized his time in the hospital, but small discrepancies began to emerge. Rodriguez noticed that Linda sounded increasingly strained during their calls, offering reassurances that felt rehearsed. When he asked to speak directly to Groves, there was always an excuse. He was resting. He was out for a walk. He was meeting with his therapist. 3 weeks after his discharge, Rodriguez decided to visit in person, Michael said. He didn't call ahead, just drove to their house one afternoon, thinking he'd drop off some books Groves had expressed interest in during one of their hospital conversations. Linda answered the door, and Rodriguez immediately knew something was wrong. She had lost weight. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she flinched at sudden movements. She invited him in but kept glancing nervously toward the hallway leading to the back of the house. Groves was in his study and emerged to greet Rodriguez with a warm smile and a firm handshake. He appeared healthy, had regained the weight lost during his ordeal, and spoke animatedly about his recovery process. But Rodriguez, with the instincts developed over decades in search and rescue, sensed the wrongness beneath the surface. He said Groves' movements were too smooth. Michael explained. Too deliberate. Like someone who's carefully thought about how a human body should move and is executing it perfectly, but without the natural hesitations and adjustments we all make unconsciously. The conversation remained pleasant but superficial. Groves deflected questions about his treatment, instead asking detailed questions about Rodriguez's family names, ages, daily routines. Questions that echoed too closely the disturbing knowledge the entity had displayed in the hospital. As Rodriguez was preparing to leave, he noticed a stack of maps on the dining room table, marked with highlighted routes through remote sections of the national forest. When he asked about them, Groves smoothly explained that he was planning a book about wilderness survival based on his experience. Rodriguez didn't believe him, Michael said. Not for a second. But he also didn't know what to do. Groves hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't made any threats. Being weird isn't a crime. Having maps isn't suspicious for someone who spent their life hiking and teaching biology. Before leaving, Rodriguez managed a moment alone with Linda, asking directly if everything was okay. Her response, "He's getting better every day," was delivered with a frozen smile, and eyes that silently pleaded for help. But when Rodriguez pressed, suggesting she and the children could stay with him if needed, she quickly backtracked, insisting everything was fine. He left his card with her, Michael said. Told her to call any time, day or night. She never did. A week later, Rodriguez received a call from the local police department. Dave Groves had gone to see Father Donovan, the priest who had visited him in the hospital, and something had happened during their meeting. The priest was unwilling to file charges but had been shaken enough to contact the police with concerns about Groves' mental state. According to the officer who called Rodriguez, Groves had requested a private confession. During their conversation, he had begun speaking in what the priest described as multiple voices overlapping, and had recited details of the priest's past that no one could possibly know. When Father Donovan attempted to perform a blessing, Groves had reacted violently, then fled the church. Rodriguez tried calling the Groves home. Michael continued. No answer. He drove there immediately, found the house empty. Neighbors said they'd seen Dave loading suitcases into the car that morning, with Linda and the kids already inside. They'd assumed the family was going on vacation. A missing persons report was filed, but with no evidence of foul play and witnesses reporting the family leaving together voluntarily, the police response was minimal. Rodriguez used his contacts to check hotels and motels in the surrounding counties, but found no trace of them. 3 days later, Linda's sister in Colorado called the police. Linda and the children had arrived at her home, distraught and exhausted from driving nonstop. According to Linda, Dave had insisted they needed a family vacation, had driven them halfway to Colorado, then pulled over at a rest stop and simply walked away into the darkness. When Linda tried to follow, he had turned to her with those terrible black eyes and told her to take the children and run, that he couldn't hold it back much longer. Search efforts focused on the area around the rest stop, but found nothing. Linda filed for divorce in absentia, changed her name and moved the children to a different state. Rodriguez attended the court hearing where Dave Groves was legally declared missing, listening as the judge acknowledged the unusual circumstances but followed the procedural requirements. And that should have been the end of it, Michael said. Another missing person. Another set of files to be archived. Another tragedy for the statistics, except 6 months after Groves' disappearance, a hiker went missing in the same area of Blackwater Ridge. The search and rescue operation found no trace of her for 3 days. On the 4th day, they discovered her backpack, carefully placed beside the trail. A mile away they found one of her boots, standing upright on a rock. The hiker herself was never found. 3 months after that, a family of 4 disappeared while camping near Crow Creek. Their tent was found intact, meals half prepared, no signs of struggle. Search teams combed the area for a week before the operation was scaled back. On the final day, Michael was part of a team checking one last section of forest. I found a child's stuffed animal sitting on a stump, he said, his voice hollow, like it had been placed there for us to find. And carved into the bark of the stump was a message. Not all of us come back from the woods. In the years since, there have been other disappearances in Blackwater Ridge. Not many. perhaps one or two a year, but enough to establish a pattern. Sometimes the missing are found, disoriented but physically unharmed, with no memory of where they've been. Sometimes only their belongings are discovered, arranged in ways that cannot be accidental. Most often they vanish completely, leaving families to wonder and authorities to speculate. Rodriguez retired 5 years ago, Michael said. Moved to Arizona, desert country, no forests. He still calls me sometimes, usually late at night when he can't sleep. Asks if I've heard anything about Groves. I always tell him the same thing, nothing. He's still out there, or whatever's wearing his skin is. I sat in silence, absorbing the weight of Michael's story. Outside, the wind had picked up, branches scratching against the windows of the fire tower like fingernails seeking entrance. You ever wonder what's really out there in the deep woods, John? Michael finally asked. What's waiting in the places between the trails, in the shadows we don't look at directly? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Every ranger wonders that at some point. Dave Groves has been missing since 2003, Michael said, standing up and moving to the window. Officially missing. But ask anyone who worked search and rescue in this area long enough, and they'll tell you. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, when they're deep in the backcountry, they hear something moving parallel to the trail. Not an animal, not quite a human. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, staring out at the darkness that surrounded us. And sometimes, just for a moment, they catch a glimpse of eyes reflecting in their flashlight beams. Black eyes. Eyes that know them, that have been watching them all along. Michael turned back to me, his expression unreadable. I don't go into the deep woods alone anymore, John. Not since Groves. And I never ever enter caves, no matter how small or shallow they seem. He paused. Because something's out there. Something old and patient and hungry. And it's learning to wear us like clothes. The wind howled around the fire tower, and for a moment, it sounded almost like words. I told myself it was just the wind, just the natural sounds of the forest at night. But I couldn't help glancing out the window, scanning the darkness between the trees, wondering what might be looking back. My name is Jonathan. I've worked in the Forest Service now for roughly 17 years. This story isn't mine, but I carry it with me every day, every time I lace up my boots and head into the wilderness. And sometimes when I'm alone on the trail and feel that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, I wonder, is it Dave Groves watching me from the shadows? Or is it something else, something that found him in a cave and decided it wanted more? Not all of us come back from the woods. Remember that. The next time you wander off the marked trail, remember that. And listen carefully to the silence between the trees. Because something else is listening too.